first it really annoyed me, but after a while I just really enjoyed reading the hate mail the comics journal got. This, like, it would be, I always wanted to read somebody who was engaging with him critically and really doing a deep analysis and wrestling. I thought that would be fabulous, but instead all I got was, you're stupid, you're saying we're stupid, and that makes you stupid, you use big words, that you just want people to think you're smart. I mean, this was the sort of tenor of the letters. It was like, wow, not really engaging at all. So last week, other than some help from Sharon in taking us on a tour of chapter 2, Time, History, and Nature, we mostly just worked on the first. We worked on the first sentence, which was just loaded with implications. I thought I'd kick us off this week by taking us, oh my God, to the second sentence, right? Which is a good one. It's Nietzsche wrote, not only the reason of millennia, but their madness too breaks out in us. It is dangerous to be an heir. This quote is from Nietzsche, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the first part on the gift-giving virtue, section 2, translated by Walter Kaufmann. And part of what he's trying to get at here is this idea that both Kenneth and Nietzsche are trying to get at this idea that, if the Oracle at Delphi says, know theseauton, know thyself, it's not enough to know yourself as an individual. You have to know yourself in terms of what you've inherited, how you came to be. You have to understand yourself in a Hegelian dialectic sense as an organism that emerges from previous states, and then includes emerging from previous organisms. So, as an individual, we think about our parents and our more distant ancestors, and what did they bequeath to us genetically or culturally, or in terms of illnesses or what have you. But what Nietzsche is saying, and what Kenneth is saying, because it gets overlooked in Nietzsche, is that he's also saying not only can an individual not understand themselves if they don't understand the history of previous individuals who contributed to creating them, but a civilization cannot understand itself if it doesn't understand the previous civilizations, because at least as much as an individual inherits things from their ancestors, so too does a civilization, in far more complex and harder to pin down ways. The earlier discussion on this call about, meaning signifying versus merely being a brand applies here, because the finger pointing to the moon, the advantage of the finger is you can see it, it's right before you, it gives you something tangible to hook the complex, more difficult to understand concepts to. We have the same problem. If we look at ourselves as an individual, we can see the color of our eyes, the color of our skin, the color of our hair. We can if we watch ourselves long enough, we can see the patterns of behavior. And it gives us very tangible ways to be reminded that there are things in us to be explained. And that if we look at our ancestors, we can compare those things and try to get some understanding of how we came to be the way we are. The problem for a civilization is that it doesn't have a body per se. It doesn't have overt, simple acts that you can point at and everybody can agree, okay, Marianne just threw the baseball. We all saw the baseball be thrown. That's a thing that actually happened. That's something we could understand and try to comprehend. The things that civilizations do are far more complicated to pin down. We can't even agree that it's happening, let alone try to get to the level where we try to understand why it's happening. What did we inherit from a previous state? So in this sentence, Nietzsche is really getting at a core concept that comes out of Heraclitus, but he's translating it into very familiar Zarathustrian language. And the concept is brought up later in the same paragraph when Kenneth Smith talks about doom, and he talks about civilizational ethoi, right? Those are both in the same opening paragraph. The reason that's important is because of the Heraclitus statement, ethos anthropoi daimon, which is typically translated as character is fate. Heraclitus talks a lot about the idea that our character, whatever state it's in at the moment, compels us to do certain things, whether we understand it or not. And that not understanding it leaves us completely out of control, effectively having no free will. If we want to have any free will, we have to study our character to figure out what its architecture and structure is. What does it want to compel us to do? What habits does it want to, what feels natural to us, whether it's natural or not? The nudges of our unconscious that lead us to find one thing plausible versus another thing that we find implausible. All this stuff is sort of the unexamined level of life in which we are steered from place to place by our character. And by tying this to the idea of a daimon and to the idea of fate, one of the things that you'll see Kenneth do is he'll use the word fatal. He'll talk about somebody's fatal mistake. And in modern parlance, that means it killed them. But that's not what he means at all. He means it in a Heraclitean sense. Their fatal mistake is a mistake they were fated to make because of their character. That if you could understand their character, you could start to see the kinds of things that they would do. You think about well-written characters from fiction who everybody knows in common. We've all shared the experience of getting to see them. We get to where what's happening is that we're starting to grok their fate, their character. And from their character, we're starting to be able to predict their fate. And so we could say, what would happen in a debate between two presidential candidates if Spock walked onto the stage? We can all sort of we could role play. What would Spock say in reaction? I do not find your proposition very logical, sir. I mean, we can imagine it. We can imagine his tone of voice. We can imagine his expression. And that's because we've been immersed in the character that's been developed to such a point that we can
he'd be chairing the debates.
Yeah.
Rather than walking on.
That's right. Yeah, or participating in the debates, even more so. And it's the case with any character that we get to know, including people that we know in our own lives. The difference between a stranger and somebody you know really well is you could role play somebody that you know really well. You could some of their typical expressions, some of their habits, some of the things that they'll do. So all of this is bound up in this concept of ethos, anthropoi, daimon. Character is fate, which was partially Heraclitus's response to the Oracle of Delphi. The thing that you have to know about yourself is your character. You have to know how it became the way that it is.
We have that quote in the chat.
Ethos anthropoi daimon. I put it in there here. Ethos anthropoi. Right. Character is fate. So anytime you see Kenneth Smith use the term ethos or ethoi, because he's such a Heraclitean, just like I can't read that word without thinking this sentence, I know Kenneth can't read that word without thinking this sentence. He's invoking Heraclitus. He's invoking the subject of free will and determinism. And he's evoking that whole concept that if you don't know yourself, you don't have any freedom. You're just a symptom of your character. You have to study your character and understand it and begin cultivating it to take an active role in creating some actual freedom for yourself, at which point you begin to become an individual to the extent to which you understand yourself. So all of that, because he refers to doom, which is a reference to fate, because he refers to ethoi, because he's talking about this Nietzsche quote, this opening paragraph is subtly saying that a civilization doesn't really have any wisdom or freedom of action unless it understands where it came from and what its core character is. To the extent to which it can understand those things, it can begin to shape itself and become a self-governing, self-evolving civilization. But to the extent to which it doesn't know those things, if it thinks that it just is the latest and greatest in history, you can ignore everything that came before, this is as good as it's going to get, we're number one. The more you get into that sort of a mindset in relationship to your civilization's character, the less free you are, the more dependent you are, the more civilization is just a symptom of the things that went into it. And therefore, as a result, the more as it interacts with the things that come up in its history, the more it's going to run down like a machine instead of adapting like an organism. All of that is being kind of brought into this opening paragraph because of the choice of words and the quotes and the references. Phil and then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I was thinking about that in this sense. It seems to me ultimately, if it comes down to representing reality, all psychology is involved in our understanding and knowing. And it seems to me like my thought then it turned to like the difference between the Greek tragedies and the Shakespearean tragedies.
Yeah.
The Greeks simply suffer in their character flaw in the tragedy and pay for it, right? What Oedipus and so forth. But it was manifested itself in its reality. But I think what happened to the structure of understanding it has incorporated that into a symbol and then a sign system. So by the time I got to Shakespeare, to be or not to be is cast in, the play is the thing, not the reality. The play is the thing. The representation is the thing that actually speaks to you rather than the reality. Because he had one opportunity to kill, his uncle who did the deed, but the uncle was confessing. And he said, no, this is not the right time to do it because then I'll just send him to heaven because he's confessing. We need the play to show us that he is really inauthentic. So I just wonder, like, if you're going to extend modernism all the way back, I think of modernism as a little later than that. You could say that it actually begins with Shakespeare in a funny way, right? That's extending it pretty early, which is sort of interesting. It does in a sense. I think Shakespeare is roughly the same time as Copernicus, and Venice and the whole idea of the trade and the development of the economy. So that's an interesting thing. And then if you take the fact that psychology in a symbol system is able to capture the motivation, then I just sort of wonder whether the flaw of humanity is that is not attracted to the light like insects is attracted to the light. It's so alluring that when you turn the sign up to 11, it just seems so compelling that you can't help but fly into it without even being conscious that it is going to be death. I just sort of wonder. It seems to me advertising had understood that structure that actually metaphysics had laid, that if they laid the psychology on top of it, it would tick the natural shortcomings, what I would call the fallingness of humanity into play and create what I call the beginning of equal two. So now we're trapped in that system.
Thank you, Phil. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, I think in terms of development, I find the science fiction scenario of Dune an interesting one, where literally humanity had created the machine had dominated his life, and then they suddenly realised, well, the meat in the middle of the machine hasn't got long to go if this keeps on happening. And so they redesigned their world as one in which humans would continue to thrive. One of the things they bring back is the idea of God. As with Nietzsche, it doesn't matter if the idea is true or not. Does it actually work for us? Does it actually make us survive? Does it make us better? And in a sense, this was a pseudo-Metternich of the Congress of Vienna, who had a view that what had come out of the French Revolution would destabilise society to such a point it would probably destroy it. And how good his vision was, I don't know. But his system did survive for about a century until the guns of August. And then we had the post-Metternich world, the Holocaust, the communist madness, the mass slaughters. And then you think, well, all those revolutionaries in the 19th century were saying, that evil Metternich is repressing us. Yeah, but when you finally did get out of the bottle, what did you do?
You know, there's a book that Kenneth Smith recommends. I'm trying to remember the name of the author. I think it's Bonhoeffer. It's called The Hollow Doll, and it's a study of Japanese culture. And it's an attempt to understand, why is it that at times of peace, the Japanese are so much better organized and more lawful than, say, in the US. They talk about the way that in Japan, if you go into a store and the store owner stepped away, you can take the things you want and leave the money on the counter, and literally no one will steal the money off the counter. No one. It just doesn't happen. And it's shocking to us because we have so many con artists and thieves that we know that wouldn't work here in the US. And we're like, well, that seems on the one hand to be a shockingly, well-organized society where people agree to help each other and to collaborate. And then he contrasts that with the war crimes during World War II and says, how is it that the exact same people who could have their stuff so together during times of peace could have their stuff so fall apart, and dissolve into chaos and just random violence, and really just straight up war crimes at a time of war. And he paints a picture of the culture and the idea that part of what, the premise, whether it's true or not, but the premise of the book is the idea that the Japanese have focused so much on what is wanted and what is not wanted, on how to achieve kind of a perfect exterior, that they've created a hollow doll in which, everything's fine unless you go off the rails. Because if you go off the rails, there's no rules to say what's wanted and what's not wanted. And all of a sudden you're looking into the abyss and you have the maelstrom. There's no general purpose guidelines that can help to steer you back to what is wanted once you're off into the realm of what is not wanted. So there is this way in which, modernism, in the early centuries of modernity, you can't quite see what modernism is becoming. And part of the reason is that it hasn't purified itself. It's still, like he talks about in the opening sentence, it's still carrying through enormous shards of the medieval world and the ancient world that are filling in gaps that are later going to appear when modernism purifies itself and gets rid of all non-rational things, like Kant tried to do in his epistemology and axiology. In the attempt to suppress everything that's not rationally decided, modernism has gradually removed all of those things that allowed it to behave in a more or less coherent naturalistic way. And it's increasingly creating itself as one of those hollow dolls, in which now there's a mechanism that says how things are supposed to work. But the moment you get outside the frame of what the mechanism was designed to handle, you've got nothing. It's just a big abyss. And so anything could happen. People who saw themselves as heirs to, Marx, who said, well, what we want to do is we want to make things better for people who work. We want to make things safer for people who work. We want to make a paradise on earth, could set in motion societies that do massive purges in which millions of people die. There's that same sense of how, on the one hand, could these be your goals and this be the result? You can see that there's something fundamentally deeply wrong, and that it's got to be at the level of where there are supposed to be general principles that help to steer you back from the chaos into order. There's an increasing dearth of them, so that, as long as you stay on the rails, everything's fine. But the moment you go off the rails, all is lost. And this is an oversimplification.
Yeah. Hi, Rick. May I very quickly respond to what you just said about Japanese?
Oh, yeah. And by the way, it's not intended to be an accurate portrayal of Japanese culture, what I said.
Oh, it's just a personal experience I had with this Japanese woman. We were both living in America, but when you meet her, she was very polite. Hi, how are you? Have this. just sort of demure, girlish, politeness and all that. And then when I got to know her, one day she was telling me, oh yeah, I went to Turkey with my boyfriend and he bought me all these things, and so, and then a couple of weeks later, or maybe it was a month later or so, she said, yeah, I traded in all those expensive things he bought me and I got cash, back from the department store. And it's like, whoa. And maybe because to a certain degree, I was in my primary years in Korea, I was led to distrust Japanese for what they've done during World War II and Korean War. Maybe my memories tend to keep negative experience or negative perceptions I have about Japanese too. Maybe that's part of it. But I just remember this and I'm thinking, it's just and there's something else that she did at the same time. At times she would do things to me or say and behave in the way, oh, you're a Korean, you are of the lesser, that kind of, and that would piss me off so much that we would take dance classes. We took the dance classes at a club, and yes. I would purposely go right in front of her and take the class, and right in front of her, right next to the teacher, things like that. So, and when I tell a story like that to my son would say, "Mom, behave yourself," But anyway.
What you're describing, that sense of on the surface, things seem fine. And then suddenly you turn a corner and you realize there's an abyss where somebody's, values and ethics should be. There's something missing in their character. This is how indigenous people respond to the United States. Whenever we say, we care about human rights, you will always on Facebook see a wave of responses from the indigenous community going, oh, really? Is that what the last 500 years of US history, show us from the treatment of indigenous people? A lot of concern about human rights. This kind of weird sense of what is on the surface, but what's going on underneath, and a massive direction between the two. The construction of a false consciousness, kind of a mask, mm-hmm. that may be a very nice mask and a very friendly mask right up until the moment when its internal program says, and now stab them in the back.
Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's, I like to ask your impression, people who are in this room. When you think of, let's say, Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans, for example, which group of people to you comes across as the most polite, courteous kind of people of the three countries I mentioned? I have a feeling you guys will say Japanese, and yet, watch out. That's my impression.
Thank you, Ginny. Phil and then Marianne.
Yeah, I'll make a brief comment on the Japanese before I go into my other thing. Yeah. I love the movies of Ozu. It's very, very Japanese. Yasujiro Ozu. He's a very, very compelling movie maker who seemed to be very quiet. But when I look at his movies, they're almost anti-movies in a funny way. And what happens is that he shows a very, very calm demeanor, but you always felt that underneath that, in other words, pretend you're living in the second floor and everything is smooth and fine, but somehow you get the feeling that the floor below you is about to erupt. It never really quite manifests itself, but you just get this feeling there's something so restrained underneath that if you should ever prick it with a pinhole, heaven knows. And so the fact that those movies been able to keep it down, and nonetheless you always are existing in this psychological tension that is actually very calm. Everything seems to work. There's always a dissonance that's about to happen. I think Ozu says it just almost exactly right in relationship to Japanese culture. But he's very Japanese when he says that. But he shows his invisibility as well as a kind of psychological sort of impact as well. So that's very interesting. And the comment I want to make is that although I sort of admire Nietzsche, I think he had misunderstood Heraclitus. Because instead of going all the way to Dionysus to take in a full revolution of rebellion, he should have listened to Artemis, which Heraclitus left his manuscripts to, right?
Yes.
Because Artemis, because even though Nietzsche loved the art so much, and I think of him as a frustrated artist, Artemis always understood the ambiguity of the pointing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because she hunts with her bow and lyre, not the bow and the arrow, but the bow and the lyre, that in a sense allow the thing that reveals and kills it and makes it disappear in a sort of unmanifest way that, in a sense, it says that maintains the mystery of the disclosure and the closing up of disclosure, that leaves it in this state that allows it to continually open rather than possessing it inward and expressing it as a full manifest idea in the arts. And I think that's where the problem really lies. Mm-hmm. And I just sort of wonder, did he just miss Artemis? And Artemis, by the way, was the sister of Apollo, right? Not Apollo himself, right, but the sister who's a huntress, a tracker that senses the world and brings that understanding, not in its completeness, to Apollo. And that relationship is kind of important, rather than a direct dispute between Apollo and Dionysus. Right. And I always thought that it was not moderate enough to understand that relationship. And I said, okay, you're brilliant, but how in the hell did you miss that, right? When you're supposedly quoting Heraclitus, I mean, or at least don't quote Heraclitus if you're going to do that.
Yeah. Part of what makes Nietzsche so interesting to read is that his personality looms so large and he brings his own struggles onto the page. He wrestles with big things that matter, but he doesn't wrestle with them in some kind of pure, perfect way that we might want him to. He doesn't lay out a whole clear schema of what he intends. He's not really overly concerned with whether we understand him or not. He's just, I feel like what we're reading with Nietzsche is a diary, in which he's working out his ideas and his struggles. And, as a result, it goes beyond taking it and leaving it. He becomes one of those characters that we learn. And eventually, if we do him long enough, we can role play him. And we can say, what would Nietzsche say? Just like we can have a debate between Spock and Nietzsche in our minds when we get to know Nietzsche well enough, because his personality is everywhere. And there's all kinds of philosophers for whom you can't say that. You can see their ideas, but you can't see them very clearly because they're actually working hard to suppress anything natural of themselves on the page and to try to leave some kind of pure crystalline design of a schema of their philosophy. But the side effect of doing that is there's fingerprints all over the place where you might like somebody to have done a cleaner approach. It's like, well, we get what we get, right? They're all human beings. Marianne and then Stephen. Go ahead, Marianne.
I was thinking about how Homer is a wanderer and how the schizoid adventure of us, we're wandering. We're kind of like almost like ants trying to find an ant trail. Mm-hmm. And I feel that we have created the schizoid things where the pragmatic has been so important to our nature. And in the pragmatic, nothing else really matters. And I think of it as stealing the indigenous lands or getting rid of all the people that aren't of our race. So white people will have an advantage for the lower payer jobs, even. So I think that schizoid thing is a manifestation that we won't stay home in the home fires and nurture ourselves and examine ourselves, like you were saying, character is fate. How we refuse to have that comfort with ourselves because we need to either get ahead or do something that is violent, that wanderer, that sense in the Western psychic to not be really comfortable in the space that we inhabit, and to have that integrity to stay in our own comfort zone. I think that we have developed the sense of self that is other. And when we discuss ourselves, we think of ourselves as our job or whatever we're doing to get ahead, but not to think of ourselves in terms of how our relationships with other people's needs are. Are we helpful? Are we loving? Have we understood the critical race theory? Have we understood where we came from? That sense of being dangerous by not examining where we have been, because we have had a violent history in this country.
Yeah, I think about Norman Bates in Psycho, who, I don't know how long it's been since people have watched the movie, but part of what's startling is the way that when we first encounter Norman Bates, he seems like a nice guy, a little nerdy, a little socially incompetent, but eager to please, wants to be friendly. He seems normal right up until he murders her. You literally don't see it coming. And when you see the full picture, what you see is someone whose personality has been fragmented into pieces, and he modulates across from one lens system to another without knowing that he's doing it, without knowing that he's shifting back and forth between effectively different personalities inside himself. He thinks he's a whole, and the reason he thinks that is that he doesn't examine himself enough to discover the evidence that he's not a whole. He's really, he won't go that far. If he starts to get too deep, he veers off to go back into his comfortable patterns of behavior. And there's if you watch a film like Psycho, one of the things that you can take away from it is, it's just a scary film and it worked or it didn't work and it was effective or it was not effective. And part of the reason that we might do that is that there's a really less comfortable way to engage with Psycho, which is this a mirror that we're looking into? Are we is Hitchcock suggesting, Robert Bloch who wrote it, are they suggesting we ought to, examine ourselves and whether our personalities work that way, examine our civilization and whether it works that way? And of course, what we do is we do what Norman Bates does, which is we veer off because it makes us uncomfortable to look at anything that starts to get at that level. And the reason is we rightly suspect that if we peel back the surface mask and look underneath, we're going to find scary things, and we don't want to find scary things. So we sort of agree that nobody should talk about that stuff. I mean, maybe in the privacy of their own home, but they shouldn't inflict it on anybody else. And this goes to Kenneth Smith's line, which is that moderns hate philosophy. I mean, we really hate it. We hate it so much. We as an academic discipline, we turned it into mere recitation of trivia. Somebody can make their degree based on one phase of one philosopher's work in the 18th century and how he used the word, discern. And that's his PhD, the use of the word discern in, so-and-so's work of blah, blah, blah. And now I'm a professor. And my whole thing is based on this sort of collection of facts and trivia in a Library of Alexandria kind of way of collecting bits without actually engaging with them. Kenneth Smith, like the other existentialist philosopher, says the point of philosophy is to change the world, not according to a program, but to make us engage at a deeper level that makes us change ourselves, that makes us think through who we ought to be. And that's exactly what modernism has prevented philosophy departments from doing. And it gets better each generation at preventing it from happening, weeding that stuff out, making sure it doesn't ever occur. So when you look at sort of the habits of what's considered polite in normal discourse, when you look at what happens to philosophy departments and philosophers, when you look at what's considered professional, which is not to be personal, versus what's unprofessional, which is to be subjective and personal, it's just really clear the extent to which we are working very hard to make sure philosophy never gets its opportunity to, to open our eyes to things that we're not supposed to look at. It's to keep us in the Norman Bates mode. Just keep going through the motions. Don't ask questions about why you occasionally wake up wearing mother's wig. Let's not talk about that. No, just move along. Stephen, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was going to draw up, if you're familiar with the Red Dwarf comedy.
Oh, yes, please.
Yeah, there was a moment where they discovered the time machine and their future selves meet their former selves. And the future selves have discovered all the advantages of hanging around in the great moments of history. And they discovered that was all the really wicked characters in history that threw the best parties. And right. They regaled everybody with their delightful moments of playing canaster with the Goebbels in Hitler's Germany. And they said, I found that these bad guys weren't so bad after all. And so, of course, the younger Red Dwarf versions are horrified at what their future selves have become.
That's outstanding. That's outstanding. Yeah. Yeah, what is discussed and what is not discussed, even though we do it. The things that we do that we're not allowed to talk about or examine, and we just shift our mind away from them sort of skittishly and go back to the program. There's this when he talks about us being schizoid, he's just opening Pandora's box there on a whole range of issues about the very strange ways that modern minds work, that moderns take for granted because we don't have any experience of medieval minds or ancient minds or other civilizational forms. We take what's going on in our minds for normal, even though if you look, in depth at these other civilizational characters and then come back and look at moderns from that perspective, it's very clear that we're not normal at all. We're very strange. And among the things that's strange about normals is the point of this essay is the fragmentation of our minds and the constant shifting from one fragment to another without realizing we're doing it. But another part of how we are kept from realizing it is that we're kept under a relentless limbic pressure. We don't really own anything. We don't really have any safe zone. When you play tag or hide and seek, it helps if there's a safe zone that you can go to, so that when the game's freaking you out, you can go calm down. You can say, well, I'm safe now. When I feel ready, when my resources have gathered and I'm ready to go back out and engage, I can leave the safe zone. But until then, I have some place to settle. And modernism is the first civilization ever that doesn't have a safe zone. There is no safe zone. You are always under pressure. You could lose your home at any moment. You could get sick and die at any moment. And there's no guarantees anywhere that you've got a safe zone. And it does things to the human mind to keep us under perpetual stress, to motivate us to be productive. It does things that we never even know.
Is there actually somebody running this game plan?
Well, that's no
because question. It looks like it's been ran by somebody. I know maybe it's all instinctive or whatever, but what's going on in the world looks like it's a program of some elite society, like in Eyes Wide Shut or something like that. It just looks that way.
Well, there's this amazing power of convergence that we don't talk enough about, but you can see acting in evolution, where when different species are subjected to similar pressures over a long enough period of time, the species change to resemble each other, to resemble the form that best adapts to those circumstances. And I think the Hegelian take would be, you don't need to have a conspiracy. You just need to have a system that keeps enough pressure on people for a long enough period of time, and the system will become self-reinforcing, and people will find patterns of behavior that allow them to, if not thrive, at least survive under those pressures, even if the way that they survive is deeply warped. But part of where we can see this is sort of in the modern look, a scientific look at the way that the stress hormones operate upon the body and the brain. And what exactly do they do? How exactly do they work? One of the ways that they summarize this as a shorthand is that they're poisons. They do very toxic things to the body and the brain, but the things they do are very good if normally you're not under stress. And you have a need to focus and to act urgently. Phil references the tiger. The tiger's coming. We don't have time right now to be reflective. We have to act. And so the stress hormones do their job and they get us out of the way. We go up the tree, or we run away, or we go get fire or something to save ourselves. But the whole point of the design of the stress hormones is that they're only there long enough to solve the problem, and then they go away. And when they go away, the body and the brain heal from the toxic damage that the stress has done to the heart, to the circulatory system, to the structure of the mind. That's how we evolved. That's what our species has been doing since its inception, right up until the modern era, where the stress gets activated and never turns off. What we imagine as relaxing would any other civilization would still call stressful. We're still in a situation of stress. It's just lower stress than the heightened stress that we're normally kept at. And we've mistaken that for a sustainable, relaxed state. We literally don't know what it's like to live the way that people lived in previous civilizational schemas. It's unimaginable from our perspective. We redefine all their terms, like being relaxed, in terms of the experiences that we have that don't have any room for that. And as a result, it means that when we read them talking about what it's like to have a reverie, we can only imagine what that must be like. We substitute in something that we have that isn't a reverie, but it's as close as we can imagine a reverie coming. And this is the problem that we have when we try to compare these different civilizations to each other, is we're again sort of warping everything through the funhouse mirror of the modern perspective, and then not really seeing them for who they are. Phil and then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, you mentioning a tiger almost made me want to quote, William Blake, tiger burning bright in the forest of the night. But I won't, because I want to get to my. But I won't get to my. I want to get to my point. It does seem that modernism has finally exposed that the economy was a deep threat that went through all cultures, right? Even though it pretends to be something else, so that it's become a sort of final destiny, so to speak. The thing I find a little disturbing about Kenneth Smith is that he only restricted to Western civilization.
Oh, yeah.
His bracketing, right? Because even if you extend it back to Egypt, who also had that thing about the economy, and then certainly the Assyrians and then the Sumerians, remember writing was invented to account for like how much somebody owes somebody in terms of bushels of grain. Not the myth of Gilgamesh, so right. That came later. Okay, that's fine. But if you extend it back to Egypt, let alone China, you would say that what happened is that they already got this understanding. And my thought was that, like in Egypt, there was an enormous struggle in a sense between Seth, the god of measurements, mm-hmm. and Osiris, the god of life and productivity, right? And remember, Seth was able to conquer, in a sense, or at least reduce Osiris to the cult of death. So you could ruin the underworld. But in mm-hmm. fact, in the current world as it exists now, measurements will rule. And I thought of this when I thought about the Nile, which was the first thing that appeared in the cosmology as the celestial cow to provide it, right?
Mhm.
And it became the Nile is the source of life itself. And how the Egyptians managed to, in a sense, control fluid dynamics. You know, people have always talked about the Egyptian culture as a mechanical culture of fluid pressures, you know, and all that. And I thought, yeah, in a way that's true. What they did was that they were able to measure the height of the depth of the Nile, and therefore, in a sense, brought it into constraint, and in a sense, brought it into civilization rather than the cult of life. And that already created a separation. So score one for Seth and technology rather than, you know, life reduced to the cult of death. I mean, they did write the book of death, you know, and Osiris did get his due by ruling in the underworld after you die. So that's kind of interesting in itself. And I think that what happened was, but that conquering of Osiris was really one of functionality and productivity of technology to produce power to rule the world. So that to me is a deeper thread than even the economy. And I think that's what the moderns missed. Yes, they got it right. They traced it back even further than the tragedies and all that. But the power ran even deeper back to Egypt, right?
Right.
And I'm thinking of China, you know, like the Tao, you know, nature.
Yeah.
You know, it came to me one day, but you know, somebody introduced me that the whole thing was Tao De Ching. Right?
Yeah.
Tao De Ching.
Yeah.
The Tao is okay. The Chinese understood that and they accepted that and was part of the culture. But the De is the problem. How to manifest the Tao through the De for a civilization, right? And so that De, the difficulty of instituting it to a civilization, was undercut by Confucius because he had a system that controlled the structure better than you. It reminds me of that movie, you know, when Jack Nicholson, you know, the guy who was, you know, the leader of Guantanamo during the trial, and you know what he was understand, you know, about Code Red, and then of course Tom Cruise says, "We want to know the truth about Code Red," right? And then finally he was pushed to the point when Jack Nicholson says the "der." You can't. Let's see.
You want the truth? You can't
handle the truth of the "der."
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
I mean, so that was his retort, and he was correct in one sense, right? Yes, you don't want the truth, because if I'm going to tell you the truth is that it was necessary for us to break the laws in order to protect the country, you know? So you can't handle the truth. And that was his defense. It was a legitimate defense, but of course, it was illegitimate in a sense, because you can't understand the "der" of instituting the ideals in an existential world. So now we are trapped in the "der" of existence and equal to rather than equal one, which is connected more directly to ambiguous truth.
Thank you, Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
I was going to say, in the troubles of civilizational dilemmas, the interesting thing is with all this criticism of the United States, which I think is largely based on envy, it's Nietzsche's and Orwell's point of envy, because the United States mostly has been a little bit better than what some other people would have been. But anyway, I think one of the most significant personalities in the modern era who made, well, I think one of the most important claims of the current era. And this is the peculiarity of the modern world, that this person is so odd. That person is Donald Trump. And this was his warning, and he's quite right, that if due to red tape and whatever and intransience, that it takes us 20 years to build an ice rink, which should only take 2, well, that might be all good and fine in your world, but we have competitors outside the United States, not mentioning China, who will bypass you, and you can have all your political correctness and all that sort of stuff. That's full. That's great. It'll last a little while. You'll send your symbol of peace to the Chinese. One day they'll come over here. They'll take what you got and kill you in the process. They'll pick up your political correctness, look at it, laugh at it, and throw it in the fire. Now, whether you like Donald Trump or dislike him, I just found that whole attitude. You can't keep on doing this. You can't spend the rest of eternity taking 20 years to build an ice rink and then extend it to 40 years or 50 years. I say this because I saw how men used to do, say, lay a road when I was 6, 9 years old or something.
Mm-hmm.
They'll finish a road about 2 kilometres. It looked like it had about 6 men working on it. Do about 2 kilometres of road. They'll finish it in a week. Now I see road works everywhere that look like they're tracing history. They're going to be there for several hundred years. It's obvious they are bleeding the public finances. Mm-hmm. This is just thievery going on. But that's the point. Yeah, you can talk about all this. Oh, the United States is bad and all this, and try all your little politically correct games. It's not going to work when the other civilizations say, they got some pretty good stuff. Let's just kill them all, enslave them, and take what they got. And will you be strong enough to defend what you got?
You know, part of what's interesting about the modern world is that it's constantly portraying its left hand and its right hand, each pretend that the other hand is an entirely different civilization. You know, you and I've talked about this before with the Soviet Union, which presented itself as the opposite of the United States, as you know, the antidote to capitalism. But what we find when we scratch the surface is that they both have intense modernist characteristics that they share in common. The idea that they're going to weather through a system of laws that are derived, you know, from U.S. elections, or a system of laws that's derived from the Supreme Soviet. They're going to lay out a recipe, and the society is going to follow that recipe, and utopia will follow. Whether it's a capitalist utopia or a supposedly socialist utopia, they're making the same modernist promises that if we're just rationalist enough, we can make everything work out great. China's the same thing. And one of the things that politicians do is try to portray China as an entirely alien kind of thing, not like us at all, a completely different civilization. But when you look at the way that it industrializes, it may be more efficient in its ability to command, you know, rapid change, but under the hood, it's just another form of modernism, and it has many of the same problems that the United States does, that the Soviet Union does, that these other structures do. So, you know, I think that the problem when we listen to any politician, whether it's Donald Trump or Bill Clinton or any of these guys, is that they're not trying to get to a profound understanding of what's going wrong in the world. They're just trying to win an election. And as a result of that, they grossly simplify the situation that we're dealing with. And they usually simplify it in the shape of, you know, who's the bad guy and who's the good guy. In the struggle, I think it was in 2016, in the Trump versus Clinton election, it turned out that from a foreign policy perspective, one of the main differences between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump was, are we supposed to be terrified of China, or are we supposed to be terrified of Russia? Which one are we supposed to be terrified of? One of them is the bad guy, but the two parties disagreed on which country was the bad guy. And each of them accused the other one of being complicit with the one that they decided was the bad guy. You know, there was this basic tug of war over how to shape the self versus other, you know, narrative. And the problem with something like a civilizational pattern like modernity is that everybody's part of it. We're all complicit in it. We're all participating in it. And, you know, we can have as many pogroms as we want trying to wipe out the bad guys, but in the end, we don't need any of them to make a bad world. We can do it all by ourselves, just by acting out what we've learned from this anti-culture we've grown up in. When I you know, this is one of the things that Kenneth Smith gets back, is when he criticizes modernity, people assume he must be taking the side of some previous civilization. Oh, well, if you're not on our team, whose team are you on, right? Because we're team modern, so you must be team obsolete, right? And obsolete is bad, so you're bad for being on team obsolete. And they'll say, well, no, I'm not on that.
That's holding up the card,
right?
The bad card. The bad card has a picture of Adolf Hitler. Therefore, everything to the left of Adolf Hitler is increasingly good.
Right.
And that's where human thought is. I think that was Jung's point, wasn't it? That most of our thought operates on that level.
This weird cartoonish level, you know, in which it's not even as simple as a one-dimensional line. It's just 2 points, the good point and the bad point. And if you're not in the good point, you must be in the bad point. Yeah, you're right. This is what we see going on all the time in these discussions. Sharon and then Phil, go ahead.
I have a comment, and it's not a happy one. We sit here and we're talking about the end times, time, history, and nature. Yeah. And we're looking at the pitfalls and shortfalls of modernists compared to the ancients and the medievalists. And we just finished talking about whether the Japanese are kinder than the Chinese. And all of that, I think, is missing the point completely, because I think we're all human. Right. And it doesn't matter where you're from, we have certain characteristics. And this brings me to Stephen's comment, the history of madness, which I find offensive. When he says, I live in a world that insists nerds suffer from a mental malady called Asperger's. It's the latest fashion. We are told it's high functional autism. Well, you know, Stephen, my only son has had Asperger's, and he's a functioning adult. So I find that offensive and really, really lacking intelligence. That's my comment.
I didn't see this.
Sharon, he agrees with you.
Lacking in intelligence is not something that I expect from anybody sitting at this table, but you don't make fun of anybody that's got any kind of malady.
No, you didn't get my point. My point is I disbelieve the concept. I don't think there is such a thing as Asperger's. I think it's a modern invention of the psychiatric profession who's out to make money, so they'll sell you anything. Yeah, sure, there's people with problems. Well, sure, there's people with bad nerves. We're all like that. I just don't believe there is an Asperger's. I think there are people that are nerds. Yeah, maybe they don't pick up on emotions that greatly. Maybe they think a lot. Fine, there's all sorts of personas, but the psychiatric profession will invent these terms because they're a business and they're selling stuff. My point there is I'm not insulting those people who think they have Asperger's. That's not the point. I'm just saying that the psychiatric profession claims there is such a thing as Asperger's. They're saying high functioning autism. What the hell does that mean?
Well, is it my turn again, Rick?
Go ahead, Sharon.
Go ahead.
Well, I think, you know, Stephen, if you would educate yourself, and having experienced it, I have to tell you, autism is a spectrum. There are people who have profound disease where they can't speak, they can't talk, and my son is a nerd. They used to call him the little professor, extremely brilliant. We had to work a lot on his social skills. And for you to sit there and say that, I don't know what you have in your country, but in this country, it's a diagnosis with an ICD diagnosis is non-existence and it's based on monetary, again, is lacking is intelligence because you do not know, you have no idea. And again, I said, the comment is almost offensive.
My ambition is not to offend people with mental maladies. I made that clear. My point is, I think it's a sham created by a monetary-driven profession.
But you need to revisit that concept because it's not.
I simply have an opinion. My opinion might be imperfect. I could even be wrong.
Well,
point to me the person who has a perfect scope on everything in the universe. Well, should we go and worship them as gods? Oh, right. If I have an imperfection in my thought, and you can criticize me, that's fine. I'm wrong everywhere. Okay, no, I don't take that. My point is we are all faulty. We all have limitations. And I'm merely expressing an opinion which is a bit different from the way you perceive the universe. Fine.
Sounds like if I'm hearing it right, it sounds like Stephen's not saying that there aren't people who have, you know, what Sharon you would call high functioning autism. It sounds like what Stephen's saying is that the psychiatric industry has pathologized that in order to make money off of it. Mm. Would that be a fair description, Stephen?
I find a lot of, it's my opinion, a lot of the stuff with the psychiatric industry, it's a money-making organisation. And a lot of this stuff to me looks like it's invented. You know, they create a little term, Asperger's, and they sell it to everybody, and everybody everywhere say, oh, I've got Asperger's, I've got Asperger's. Yeah, look, I believe there are such things as nerd. I'm a nerd. The philosophy world's full of nerds. People who watch Star Trek are nerds. That doesn't mean that they're some broken machine. They're just people maybe with a few imperfections, a few problems. I detest the idea that people are running around concluding that they are broken machines, because how can you ever get better?
Yeah, I think, yeah, Stephen, I also do agree with Stephen, because I think I agree with that. Too many categorization and diagnosis by that profession is true to a large extent. And it's unfortunate that a lot of these people are categorized and sort of looked upon by society as though that they're not perfect, or whatever the term you want to use. But what was I going to go with that? But then who is perfect? And I agree with it. It's everybody has some sort of a, I don't know, maybe disorder is too strong of a word, but everybody has quirkiness and neurosis, you know, and yet luckily a lot of people have not been categorized yet. So, I mean, these people who are, you know, diagnosed as Asperger or autism or whatever, 100 years ago, they didn't have those words, right? Isn't that correct? I mean, these words came about when? I don't know. These terms came about.
Oh, this is really a very, very important point from individuals who have no experience. Let me say this. I absolutely take the point about labeling and categorizing people, right? And we all have different personalities, different psychological tendencies. Mm-hmm. But when you have a kid who you detect has got, in fact, my son presented with delayed speech. That's how we started having him evaluated. And he was not labeled because it was a fun thing to do or because the psychiatrist wanted to make money. It was because he had symptoms. And in olden days, Jenny, the people who had these mild disorders did not become functional individuals. They were left to the wayside.
Right.
Well, even in my own family, yeah, in my own family too. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Modern times have evolved to the point where we can identify, modify, and enhance functionality. And to sit back on the side and talk about categorization is to be prejudiced and uninformed. And I am very, very adamant about this. I see schizophrenics that are able to maintain a job because we now have medication, long-acting medication, which allows them to be functional. Is that a money-making category too? Or when you're hearing voices and sounds and doing odd things?
Right.
So for you to say, for you to pick on this, and this is, I don't know if this is modernity where we can't figure out what has meaning, right? Well, one of the
I might add here, it's the history of madness. That's where this started off. It's a debate about the history of madness.
Well, moderns who are uninformed and give opinions about things that they know nothing about are mad. So I agree with you. It is the history of madness.
Yeah, Sharon, even in my own family.
I am sorry to be, and I'm not apologizing for this. If you're going to open your mouth and criticize, then you should have a depth of information. You should have a fund of knowledge.
We can all play that game. I can play it too.
Well, Sharon, in my own family too, there's a history of Asperger, if you want to call it, in my own family too. One of my older brothers, his own children have said, yeah, my dad has Asperger. And he's had these symptoms even as a teenager. I didn't know what that was until years later, until I was an adult, that's why he did some of the things that he did. But he also was a high functioning person. You know, he would count everything. He would be counting this and counting that and counting. And but he was able to hold down a job most of his life, or basically all of his life. He retired when he was in his mid-70s. But so Sharon, I understand. I mean, we have genetics with that kind of symptoms in our own family too. So,
well, I don't need any company. The most famous guy who has Asperger's is Bill Gates. If you watch his eye contact during interviews, you could see it. So it's not as though these people, they are stigmatized or people are making money off of them. The most important point I want to make here is if you identify it early, you enhance the functionality of that adult. And that's my own point. And if you don't understand it, then you need to become exposed to it. In fact, the United States Tennis Association now has just established Autism Foundation, where they're teaching these high-functioning kids to play tennis because it's such an individual-driven game. My son is a great tennis player. He developed enough social skills that he was captain of his high school team, tennis, and in college, right? So when you hit on that, you really hit a nerve in me because it's lacking in intelligence, and that's what I'm talking about.
All right. But in your book, I lack intelligence. Fine, I'm cool with that.
Just that comment, not you, that comment.
I agree with a lot of it. I'm just another nail to be hit down with the hammer. Fine, I'll be just that nail sticking up and everyone's got a hammer and they just want to hit you down. Fine. Rick, I will be Dr. Eske's nail. I will stand up.
Well, on that note, thank you, Sharon, for sharing your personal experience with it. It makes a big difference, you know, to conversations like this. It brings an existentialist element to it when you've actually had the experience that relates to the subject at hand. You know, working in the medical profession with medical software, I'm almost always going to privilege the perspective of the people who actually live with whatever the phenomenon is. Over the rest of us, we're just trying to understand it, from arm's length. So thanks for bringing that in. We'll go to Phil and then Marianne, and then back to the text. So Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, it is important to know that we are all flawed individuals, and none of us understand everything. And it is important to not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because you have a certain overarching understanding that in a sense pretends to veil over everything.
Right.
And to that degree, I certainly agree with Sharon that where you do not understand, you should try to be silent, right? And even then we do make mistakes because we think that we have an understanding, but try at best to be self-critical enough to know when to be quiet, to be silent when you don't know. And then when you spoke out and realized that you didn't know, then maybe you should at least try to keep silent the next time. So that's being self-critical, as well as like not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because not everything that the moderns have provided is wrong by nature.
Yes.
But on the other hand, I think there is some truth in the fact that money does have an important part to play in the system, because my thought is equal to has become so dominant that in a way it's almost the only game in town. So that therefore you are almost in some ways paying some homage to it. And it's a system that's so tight that it doesn't allow you to see beyond its structure. And even, like I said, I always think like, you have sold out, and their answer is no, I have bought in. And that's their answer. And at this point, it almost seems foolish that you have not sold out, because you're not playing the game. So I also understand that. Okay, what I guess what I want to get at is that, I was in a meeting a couple of days ago in which this guy seemed very intelligent. And so I thought, okay, I will let him speak and see what he has to say. And basically, he had fallen into the kind of the metaphysical structure of knowing, and he think that he's superior, and I was a little bit shocked that he was Black. And I'm saying, like, and finally after he said, like, that was talent, and you overcome these, and you could invent things and do things, and you're superior. And I finally said, and somebody said, well, was somebody respond to that? I said, well, I'll take a shot at it. I said, your inventiveness, how's it working with your inventiveness about governments? Does it really care about the people who are not as inventive as you are? Have we constructed a system that, in a sense, is oppressive, and you have not understood the oppression that otherness feels? And I said, how about your inventiveness about business, and that you're making money and everything seems right to you? Are you concerned with the fact that nature is now falling apart? That 90% of the vertebrate species that's mammalian is now by mass domesticated, and that we have created this structure? How do you feel about that? Perhaps you feel like, oh yeah, Jeff Bezos is able to go out in space. I have nothing against going out in space and exploring the new dimensions. But if you think that going out to space to extract resources that we're running out because it took hundreds of millions of years for the dinosaurs' remains body and other things to develop into oil, and within 100 years we have depleted that, do you think that this culture of extraction is infinite? And that if not, you could at least go out somewhere else, and perhaps even terraforming Mars for another place to live? First of all, that will exclude all those people who are too poor to get there. Second of all, like, you know, the latest science did said they're trying to find life, at least one dimension of it. And their paradigm is follow the water. And now they finally, at, extra planets that's outside of our solar system, but within our galaxy. They found many planets now that have water, and they realize, oh, maybe it's not just following the water, but the right amount of water in relationship to land to produce the potential biology for life to exist. Maybe when you get to these other planets, carbon-based material cannot exist, right? How is that working? Is this all working out right? I mean, we are clever indeed, but where has this cleverness gotten us, And so he didn't respond, but I presume that at least put some doubt in his idea about his superiority, about exploiting others and not having enough care and compassion for otherness, let alone, at least in colonialism, we only exploited the otherness external to us. Now we are definitely exploiting even those within our own system. We're supposed to be fair to each other, at least within that. So, I think that one has to begin at least with at least a modicum of care for others. Maybe you could say, and I myself do say, you can't say everybody is equal, but there should be enough equality that every voice should be heard and the distribution should be good. And like I said, how about your supply chain? Your supply chain, one damn ship has thrown the whole, let's say, just-in-time economy to be inefficient, and that you should invent a system that's at least more resilient in relationship to efficiency as well. So that was my answer to his arrogance, as far as I'm concerned. And I was surprised that he was arrogant being Black, because he should have understood that he was an oppressed class.
That's an assumption that you make again. And it's in the same vein that I just talked about. People are human. It doesn't matter what they look like or where they come from or the language they speak. It's the spirit that you're looking for. And if this is what this is what we as moderns don't have, and I'm sorry I'm breaking the chain, Rick, but your comment is not much different from Steve's.
Yeah.
You can't say because I am Black, therefore I must act a certain way.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just sort of surprised that he have not felt the oppression, that in a sense the system is not.
Well, if you look at the Supreme Court Justice, Clarence Thomas, who doesn't represent any minority issues, but he looks Black and he is Black.
Yeah.
And he grew up using a pit toilet. He's just suppressed that experience. And once he got on the roof, he kicked the ladder away. So that's not a surprise. That's what his spirit chose to do. And anybody can do that. Caucasians do that too. They come from poverty to wealth, and then they don't help anybody. It's the human spirit we're talking about rather than the vehicle that we come in.
Now, there's this interesting line in Martin Luther King's speech about the dream, where he dreams of a day where his children won't be judged by the color of their skin. And everybody stops with that part of the quote, but the rest of the sentence reads, but by the content of their character. In other words, he's in favor of people being judged, but he wants them to be judged by their spirit, by their character, by how they show themselves in the world, what they do in the world. He says you have to be able to evaluate the differences between people, but the differences that matter, the differences that are important, and he drives you to character and spirit as being the important dimension. And in that, it was a very Heraclitean thing for Martin Luther King to say.
Yes.
That character matters. You have to focus on it. Because so many, especially in America, so many people have misinterpreted Martin Luther King as believing that he says you shouldn't judge. He's like, oh yeah, you should totally judge, but you shouldn't be judging on the things that don't matter. You should be judging on the things that do matter.
Right, but judge, you're based on who you are inside, not your outer appearance, right? Right.
Right, because character is fate. Because whatever your character is gonna drive your behavior, and it'll drive whether you behave in a loving way or in an opportunistic way. For example, Marianne, and then I'm going to take a.
So for myself, how I help build my character is to see where my heart shuts down. And then I have to evaluate, is there trauma there? Is there something that I am being triggered by? Is it a hurtful experience and I want to project it onto another person?
Right.
I have to analyze who I am, and who I am is one of those great questions. And I feel that I believe in biostatistics, and there are clusters of illnesses that happen around things. And even with autism, there is air pollution. There is a clustering around air pollution. And I believe that we are merciful when we try to understand what is happening, and can we be effective in our search for our making the human condition healing, as opposed to divisive and argumentative and tiring.
Thanks, Marianne. I'm going to take us back to the text now.
Sorry, Ray.
What's that, Sharon?
I said, I'm sorry, but I see all of this as big picture, and it's all about who you are and how you see the world. And I guess it's the ancients and the medievalists and the moderns. And moderns are having a big problem with relating to each other.
Right. Right. Yeah. The fact that as moderns we live in abstraction as our natural water that we swim in means that it is very natural to us. It's lawful in the structure of our character for us to overreach and to describe things that we don't have any experience with, because we're so used to relying on logic and reason to fill in the gaps in our experience that we and because the structure of modern civilization so insulates us from the consequences of doing that in our personal lives, that it's I think moderns don't understand how often they do what just happened in this conversation, where we say the thing that makes sense to us, but we don't realize that it's papering over an area where we don't have a lot of experience, and that we're better when we're speaking from experience, because then we've got our gnosis that's informed by the real world. Like Sharon, in your case with your son who has Asperger's, you have a wealth of understanding because of lived experience in that area that I don't directly have. And so this was an opportunity to see kind of what happens when noesis and gnosis collide. So, in this opening paragraph, the last thing I thought I would draw our attention to before we move on to the ancient section is the next to last sentence. Opens with stuff that we talked about last week, but it closes with something we haven't talked about as much. It says, but these diverse optics can be sorted out, each lens system with its own historical origin and its internal logic. And then this is the part that matters. However much it disrupts and is disrupted by the others. See, the thing that moderns do when they're willing to admit, which they mostly aren't, that their minds are full of fragments of different belief systems, they still think that would be okay. I can still put together an objective picture of the world. I just have a toolkit with a bunch of tools, and it's fine. And that tool model of optics, of worldviews, is in the opinion of this existentialist philosophical tradition, a grave misunderstanding. Says that the lens systems in our minds are not our tools to use. We end up being their tools to manipulate. They act in us with autonomy. They act in us, they're in our brain, and our brain uses them. And when our brain uses them, our brain role plays them and becomes them. And as a result, these different conflicting worldviews, they are often deeply incompatible with each other. Each worldview, part of what makes it a worldview is that it has an opinion about everything in the world. It is a way to organize all of experience into one semi-coherent picture of how things are. And in that picture, some things matter and other things don't. Some things are good and other things are bad. There's a whole range of values that are injected into everything. Nothing is taken as just a fact. And the problem with different worldviews existing side by side in your head, unexamined, is that they are having contradictory evaluations of what matters and what doesn't matter. And we're not seeing that happen because we're refusing to admit that they have that much autonomy in us. We insist on pretending that they're just like a hammer I'm picking up and using and putting down. And as a result, it makes it impossible for us to understand the massive internal conflicts of right and wrong and values that are introduced by this fragmentary mental structure. The exact same person in one mood who would hate something, in another mood would love that thing and would never remember that a moment ago they'd hated it, because they've gotten so used to hopping from one lens system to another that the incompatibilities in their own thinking and evaluating have become something that they instinctively, reflexively suppress. Their own incoherence disappears in the place where it would be most apparent, which is, when do I get angry about something versus when do I not get angry about something? When do I think something is a good thing versus when is it a bad thing? This idea that worldviews disrupt each other and are disrupted by each other. This goes to the heart of why the medieval worldview was a revolution against the ancient world. It was incompatible with it. You couldn't have them both at the same time. It had to overthrow the old order because it was toxic to the old order, just like the old order was toxic to it, which is why it had to overthrow it. The same is true for modernism in relation to the previous two epochs. The value system, the way of valuing the world and evaluating it, they're antagonistic to each other. They're incompatible with each other. It's why modernism, wherever it goes, stamps out and annihilates indigenous cultures. It stamps out and annihilates overly non-modernistic perspectives. It's trying to homogenize in order to remove the internal dissonance and create a machine order that could keep going. And anytime somebody arises with a strong dose of medievalism or the ancient worldview or some other civilizational, perspective, if they come into the modern world with that in a heavy dose and they're charismatic enough to have an effect on the world, modernism reacts violently. There's a reason why Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and the Black Panthers got destroyed in the United States. And it's because their worldviews were incompatible with modernism, and modernism reacted to remove the irritants, right? We can argue all day long about systematically who's responsible for doing that, but at a deeper level, what's going on is the disruption that's introduced when you get a charismatic Black man who's a preacher and can reach out to millions of people, and he starts saying things like, what if we stopped being racist? What if we stopped allowing there to be so much poverty? What if we stopped the Vietnam War? He gets into that stuff and whole power structures freak out because that view is incompatible with their way of doing business. They can't exist at the same time. So that's what it is at a civilizational level. But at a personal level, the thing about these diverse optics that Kenneth is talking about is that part of why we can't understand the world is that our own different ways of understanding sabotage each other. And we don't even realize that self-sabotage is taking place because we don't know where we got those optics or even that we have them. So what he's laying out in this opening paragraph is the program for the entire book. He's saying, if we can sort out where these optics came from, if we can learn to identify how each one works, then we're going to gain the ability to look inside ourselves and recognize them. When are we doing something that's very ancient? When are we doing something that's very medieval? When are we doing something that's very modern? And we're going to start to be able to see where they conflict with each other. And that's going to give us some ability to rework our character and do something about ourselves and shape ourselves. Without that, we're operating in the dark while constantly shooting ourselves in the foot and thinking somebody else is doing it. So that's what I wanted to draw our attention to in this first paragraph. Phil and then Sharon. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, it seems to me there's a dissonance in a way between form and content.
Yes.
And I'm thinking of form as manifested actually in civilization, if not in the moderns, but in civilization altogether, is a mind over meaning. And form, I think the problem is when you switch to another form of understanding, then in a sense, you are in a sense trying to invent a way for mind to understand the understanding. And quite often you lose the content within its way, because that becomes flushed out. And that's why I would call throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And if there was a way to retain some of the content at least and incorporate it into the new form of understanding for the mind, because we do have a desire to understand. We can't just sort of grope through things like, oh, there it happened again, it over and over again and all that. So you're trying to like structure it into understanding and then a kind of knowing, which in a sense purifies the, I guess, the content. And I look at a very decisive moment because I do understand modern art. And the decisive moment was really when between Cézanne and Picasso. I mean, I think the 19th century sort of realized that the old form of, let's say, the mythic forms was wearing down. And so I went back to sort of try to sense the world in nature, through romanticism. But that romanticism casts itself in the old forms. And of course, the Impressionists try to just deal with pure sensual relationships. And it really didn't quite have a form. And I think that was what Cézanne was struggling to find a way to coordinate with the forms as well as retaining nature. And so the decisive moment was when the search for the finding switched over. Cézanne continued to find things in nature to contain it in the form and the structure that's new in terms of understanding. Picasso decided, and I think the modernists decided, that finding is no longer should be in nature, but in the process of making. Making becomes something that exposes the content within the making process that is the content of the form.
Yeah.
So that is actually an allure into a kind of almost a totality of the form itself becoming the content. And we could see this in a sense, and there's a vague relationship to nature. I mean, actually, not really nature, but back to Plato, in Mondrian. By the way, I like Mondrian, but it was only one aspect of it. And that the structure becomes a dominant structure that, in a sense, that reifies itself through manifesting the form and, in a sense, forgetting the content. And that may, in fact, be a relationship that has to do with the fact that, as I call it, equal two have become so powerful that, in a sense, the source of understanding is within equal two rather than equal one. And I think that's where a big mistake was made, that in a sense, we have not nature have faded away, but in some sense, it's almost been flushed off. Like now we know the structure, and within the structure, we can unfold the microstructures within. And I think that's, to me, although I do like, Cubism is inventing a language that allows you to now display this, it nonetheless has in some sense flushed away the meaning and the content within it to a great degree, and eventually degenerate it into a pure language of signs.
Yeah.
And I think that is a mistake. That I think that to a certain degree, I don't know whether you put in postmodernism, is trying to somehow desperately recuperate, but is probably not doing a very good job. So you're left with, in a sense, Dada as seeing that this tragic understanding of the classical era has turned into a farce because the play now truly is the thing.
Thanks, Phil. Sharon, go ahead.
Well, I have to say that, Rick, I like when you follow Phil, because Phil can absolutely confuse me, right? But I wanted to, it's good confusion though, because I learned so much from it. But I wanted to follow up on that sentence that you just talked about from the text. You said, but these diverse optics can be sorted out, each lens system with its own historic origin and its internal logic. And in your explanation of it, I kind of got the impression that as human beings, we can't hold two diverse systems because we're too fragile to do that. The fragility of our nature doesn't allow us to have two diverse systems, analyze them, and make something of it. And what I want to say is that when you've seen as much suffering as I have, we do. We absolutely do. And looking at the three time periods here, the ancient, the medievals, and the moderns, I don't think if there are clear lines of demarcation between them, and you can correct me on that. My impression is that there was a building on each time period, and that the critical mass, right, manifested itself as the medieval period. But I'm very sure there were still some ancients around in that culture with ancient beliefs and practices. Right. So I think what a culture manifests is when you have a dominant critical mass. And we can see it in the culture that we live in now. The culture of Trump is, I think from where I sit, and I could be wrong, is a minority, but they control the narrative. They have a very, very loud voice. And the question I keep asking, is this a critical mass that's going to change the way we see ourselves, right? And I think we can hold two differing opinions in our mind and make sense of them, because again, we come right back to our humanity. Our humanity is profound, and it's a very sophisticated entity.
So yeah, along that, certainly Kenneth Smith believes that we can hold multiple perspectives in our mind. Says, but the key to doing that is knowing that you're doing it. If you think that you have a unified perspective when what you actually have is fragments, then you don't understand yourself at all. But if you deliberately cultivate multiple perspectives, knowing their incompatibilities with each other, then you're able to deal with them intelligently. And indeed, it gives you perspectives and capabilities for creating personal and cultural freedom that you wouldn't have at all otherwise. So, he would agree with you that it's something we can do. But we get into an enormous amount of trouble when we're just born into it and we don't know that that's what's happening. You see this, for example, in the way that people respond to criticisms of modernism. People don't like modernism to be criticized because modernity hates to be criticized. It wants to be the best. It wants everyone to admit that it's the winner and everybody else lost. And as part of that, what it means is that people are constantly crediting modernity with things that modernity is not actually responsible for. Some of the core ideas of science, for example, are deeply pre-modern. The ancient worldview that says that nature is preeminent is really deep in science. Core to science is this empirical idea that our theories have to be held accountable, that it's not enough to just reason and logic our way to the truth, but we have to test those ideas against what the world has to teach us. And that this is what he means by physiocratic. He means physiocracy as opposed to theocracy or democracy, the three kind of core ideas. Who's in charge? Is the world and nature in charge? Is God in charge? Or are people in charge? And the premise of the medieval order is theocratic. It's that God's in charge. We're going to make a society in which we make God be in charge. The premise of modernism is that people are in charge. We decide for ourselves how we want to run the world. We're not going to let tradition guide us. We're not going to let religion guide us. We're just going to choose. And we're going to make laws and we're going to build an economy and it'll be rational. So in some sense, in the modern order, even totalitarian forms of the modern order are democratic in this broader sense, in that we're saying that people rule over nature and over God, that it's people who decide one way or another, whatever their system may be. But what the ancients believed was in physiocracy, which is that, nature is the authoritative voice. That it's up to if nature says something is true, then it's true, and if nature says something is false, then it's false. And that idea, even though we call science a modern thing, that idea is at the heart of science when science is doing its best, and that's an ancient idea, not a modern idea at all. You see what I mean, though? If we don't know the history, if we don't know where science arose from and what these differences are in these epochs, it would be very easy for us to say, well, if it's got science, then it's modern, and therefore modernity gets credit for science, which isn't exactly how this works. So I guess what I'm getting at here is kind of this is why he's saying that we need to study these different epochs and these different optics so that we can actually trace the true pedigree of the different belief systems that we're operating according to, and understand better for each epoch what were the good things it introduced, what were the bad things, and what are the things that are just quirky characteristic of that era. The other thing that I'd say is each epoch doesn't just build on the previous one. That's a modern perspective, that modernity is a superset of everything, that we have all the good things. But instead, each epoch not only builds on the previous epoch, but it also repels and rejects enormous parts of the previous epoch. And that's because when it inverts the value system, some things that were considered incredibly important in the previous epoch are now considered not important at all, or even just bad. And so there's a shoving away that happens, not just a building upon or embrace of the whole. And we can't really understand any epoch unless we understand what it shoved away. What did it overthrow and devalue and say we shouldn't focus on and we shouldn't make decisions according to? And particularly in the modern epoch, when we think that we're a superset of everything that came before, when we think we haven't lost anything that came before, it sets us up to not understand ourselves and the world because of that. And what I find is that going through this book, what we're going to discover is that the exploration of what we shoved away and devalued is one of the most interesting parts of learning about modernism this way, because it's one of our enormous blind spots. We don't realize what is the specific character of the things that we've rejected, because we don't admit we rejected anything. We think we're all free and we can do whatever we want. So, but otherwise, I'm with you on that, Sharon. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Phil, and then we'll move on into the ancient order.
Into the physiocratic, which I've been waiting for.
Yes, the physiocratic. Here we go. But Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I recently attended a meetup that I'm not familiar with, so I want to confess that from the beginning. Called the violence of the sacred, which sort of sounds interesting. So I attended it, and I seemed to comprehend what the guy's saying. And he said the whole idea of the sacred was from the beginning a sham, a pretext for the real structure for power. And what happened is this, the sacred was projected as a triangularity between the struggle of the two dominant powers to institute the sacred and struggle for the sacred, their sacred as the overarching principle that governs the struggle, the real struggle for power. And this was, in his case, projected even to the ancients. And that would, to a certain degree, explain the problem of paganism. There's too many sacred things, everybody's struggling to project their sacredness into these things, okay? That they never really believe in the, you know, the treeness of tree or any of that as the power to control that structure, okay? Which is sort of interesting. And this struggle especially becomes more intense when the difference becomes diminished. And they pointed out that the struggle become more intense when the lieutenant becomes powerful enough to challenge the power of the alpha, right? Because if you're one of those silings that's way in the back of the line, oh, you let him be different. That's okay. There's no challenge to the system, right? So the struggle becomes very advanced and becomes essentially a kind of war. And that's where the violence comes in. And the only way you could overcome that, other than just simply defeating the enemy, is for what the sacred demands a kind of sacrifice, you know, of death in the scapegoat. So you put it onto another and say, look, that's what's wrong with our society. Let's unite and put it on the scapegoat. And this, of course, was especially true with the Nazis in relationship to the Jews, right? Because that's what brings back the struggle into a unity, right? To create the otherness of the other so you can project all the evils onto that thing and retain the sacred, which eventually will erupt into another thing because eventually the sacrifice of the other becomes the scapegoat, becomes diminished, and you have to struggle again. So that was interesting that all of that sacredness was really a pretext to the reality that's happening, which is the struggle for power. I thought that was a pretty deep understanding that's worth examining, and that religion itself, in a sense, is brought into as the arbitrator, because now you got to sacrifice the goat. In this case, the goat is the Jews or some other, you know, the Islamic people or the American Indians or whatever. And therefore, in a sense, now you could become innocent and you have the worship of the sacred again. And I think this is kind of interesting because we are now exhausted, I guess, our projection, although we keep trying to project it into China and so forth. And so that the struggle is now in the structure of government itself to achieve that synthesis. And now we know that we are actually going to sacrifice, maybe what's online is the scapegoat now is the Constitution. And so that's interesting how that whole triangle operates. And I think it's exposing what the real structure of humanity is about. Not really about the sacred, but about power. So I am not totally believing that, but I think there's enough truth for me to actually reflect upon that as the fallenness of humanity. As I said, my fallen angels is about the fact that, we are the missing link between the animal and the human. Mankind is the thing that keeps falling back to this power struggle.
Right. Yeah, it's a very modernist take that underneath it all, nothing really means anything, and it's just a struggle for power. The modernist take is that, nature's not sacred, the gods aren't sacred. Modernism starts out by saying humanity is sacred, but it's a self-contradictory position. And by the mid-modernist era, it becomes clear that what it means by that is nothing is sacred. And so might makes right. We should do whatever we have the power to enforce. From a modernist perspective, all of nature ends up seeming like just a might makes right struggle for winners and losers. They see evolution as survival of the fittest instead of something more sophisticated. They see religion as merely whose God wins, and therefore which religious group wins. This is modernity's will to power sort of being reflected upon all of these other epochs. And we're so marinated in this perspective that it's always going to sound at least partially reasonable. Even if we reject it, some part of us is going to ring in harmony with it and go, yes, that. And we may not like that part of ourselves. We might reject it and be extra strong, saying, no, that can't be right. But this is what we've been soaking in, so it looks normal to us. The other thing that's very modern about it is the take that the way things are now is the way things always have been, that the limits of a modern human being are the limits of all human beings, and nobody has ever been different from this or could be. That everybody's just some version of us. But we'll explore that over the course of the book. Sharon, go ahead.
The question I have, isn't the sacred power? I see primitive man has always demonstrated or sought after the sacred, because that was where the power came from. So I don't separate the two. And you can help me understand that.
No, I ultimately agree with you. But what I'm saying is that idea of it actually being a pretense for earthly power is actually what's driving society. Because finally, the kingdom of heaven, if there is such, is merely a pipe dream for the kingdom on earth. So I'm not dismissing that. I don't believe in that. Deep down, I believe in the fact that there is a sacred, although I do not believe in a God. I do believe in the sacredness of something.
Thank you, Phil. Sharon stepped away just as we're about to dive in. Oh, she's back.
I'm right back.
All right, so let's dive in. One of the responses to that, which is going to unfold over the course of the book, is that we find in every epoch that all of the core terms are defined by the worldview of that epoch, and that applies to power just as much as it does to anything else. So the answer to any kind of question about, is the sacred about where power is, the answer is always going to have to be, well, which definition of power do we mean? Do we mean modernist power? Do we mean medievalist power? Do we mean ancient power? Do we mean indigenous power? Because they're all very different things. So an example of that is time. He made time the first word of the chapter. And I'm going to emphasize that now to introduce the opening sentence of the Ancient Order. He says, the ancient worldview is naturalist, physiocratic, which means naturalist. Now, it means nature rules. Nature is a dynamic order of existence that rules and runs itself on its own. That is, it carries on autonomously, like our breathing or digestive processes, or the evaporation and condensation of water through its meteorological cycles, or the regeneration of species by propagation. Heraclitus has this great quote that I bring up from time to time on this, where he says, the universe is and always has been an ever-kindling fire, always igniting by measures and going out by measures. And when he talks about the bending back, things that are at variance with themselves can agree with themselves, that there's a power in the bending back, as with the lyre or the bow. He's talking about the way that one of the things that characterizes nature and the way that nature rules is that the different forces, it's not as simple as saying that they're in harmony. That's why he coins the phrase the hidden harmony. He's saying they're harnessed to each other, so that at the same time that they're in opposition to each other, they're also reinforcing a healthy range in which things can thrive. So if you pull too far in one direction, the other forces are going to pull you back in the other direction to bring you back into the center zone. So there's movement and flexibility, but there's also a kind of elastic quality to natural systems. And that elastic quality isn't imposed by God, and it's not artificially created by human beings passing laws to change policies. It's inherent in the way that nature rules by harnessing all of its powers onto each other into a self-reinforcing system. And the result of that is that the logical model for time itself in the ancient worldview is eternal. That it had, when he says the universe has always been, he's postulating an infinite past, and he's postulating an infinite future. And one of the things that's important to understand the ways in which different worldviews disrupt each other is that this is the exact opposite of the medieval worldview on time. In the medieval worldview on time, God created the universe at a specific time, and he's going to end the universe at a specific time. There is both a beginning point and an end point. There's no infinity in the past, and there's no infinity in the future, right? The medieval perspective is very demarked, and it's demarked by God, who did it because he said so. That is to say, the limits on the cosmos imposed by a transcendental God are imposed from above. They have nothing to do with the internal system keeping itself in any kind of balance. And so when you shift from the ancient worldview to the medieval worldview, you shift from a nature that's self-governing, a form of cosmos and a form of order, into a nature that can't possibly govern itself, in which its forces are all just, they lead every which way. It's just degeneration. It's just entropy. And if there weren't God constantly hemming it in and keeping it going, it would fall apart immediately. You know, Jonathan Edwards, was it Jonathan Edwards who said sinners had the sinners in the hands of an angry God? Or am I quoting the wrong? I may be quoting the wrong early American preacher. But that idea that we are suspended above an abyss of hellfire, and the only thing keeping us up is God, and God's keeping us up at every single moment. And if he were to blink, which he wouldn't do because he's omnipotent, but if he were to blink, we'd be destroyed. We'd fall into the fire. So this is a self-destroying nature. This is a self-deconstructing nature that's premised in the medieval view of nature. And it's a bound time, right? A finite time in which only certain things matter, and everything outside of that is the realm of God, you know, who existed before time and will exist after time. The eternity that's postulated in the medieval worldview is not the kind of infinity of the ancient physiocratic order. It's not an infinity of an actual nature existing. It is an eternity of death. It's an eternity in which nature ends, and now we're translated into a different Platonic world of eternal forms, in which the very concept of time doesn't make sense, which is why it's an eternity rather than an infinity. So if you look at the structure of this idea of the cycles of life, the meteorological cycles, the regeneration of species by propagation, the evaporation and condensation of water, breathing, digestion, all of these things he's describing are specific examples of the forces of nature being bent back upon themselves in order to create an elastic whole that perpetuates itself to create an infinite time. You see what I mean? These aren't separate topics. This is one thing he's talking about, that the ancients have a very specific concept of a metabolic cosmos, that because it is metabolic, it is autonomous, and therefore it can extend itself indefinitely. And that this is alien to the medieval worldview. And as we will discover, it's also alien to the modern worldview. The modern view of time and nature and all these other things is radically alien to either the medieval or the ancient. So once again here, he's kind of opening with a hugely packed sentence that carries with it an enormous body of connotations, trying to strike to the heart of what the worldview is. Stephen, and then Phil, and then Sharon. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, one of my big problems, particularly when I come up against people with a socialist viewpoint, is their arguments. Generally, they say they are atheists. Okay, I say to them, look, you guys keep on continuing with this sort of moral ethos, which, as Nietzsche pointed out, was Christianity light. You've taken the God out of it. And to my mind, yeah, the Christians actually had the better rationale. They're claiming that their morality was supported by an all-powerful arbitrator. That's consistent.
Right.
But the moderns, who seem to be trying to push a very similar morality, which has no basis in any powerful, all-powerful being, I'm just thinking, really? Your moralisms and ethics all fall to pieces because they have nothing to hold it up. And yeah, I just question that. To me, it's obvious. Darwin was right. Nature is all about the stronger, the rare minority which is stronger, overcoming the weak and consigning the weak to darkness. That is where we are now in the modern world. Knowing that, you might want to go back to that nice little medieval bubble. I mean, it was pretty certain. It was well adapted to the human sentiment. Mm-hmm. But look, to me, the modern mind is playing with fire and doesn't understand it's playing with fire. And I think that was Metternich's point when he tried to suppress the humanistic movements.
Yeah, I mean, he's, part of what's going on in here, and this is one of the things that's going to make people really uncomfortable, is that, Kenneth Smith isn't straightforward critiquing atheism, but he is critiquing the incoherence of modernist forms of atheism. And in the same token, he's also critiquing modernist forms of Christianity, modernist forms of Islam, modernist forms of any religion. Because what modernism does to worldviews is shatter them into fragments that are incompatible with each other and incoherent. And you see when you talk about, atheists not being able to explain coherently where their value systems come from, it's a much bigger problem than that, Kenneth Smith is saying. It's that no modern can explain where his value systems come from. It's why when the 3-year-old asks the third why in a row, we say, because I said so, shut up. So even a 3-year-old with a very brief sequence of questions can throw moderns into chaos, because we're so unable to explain where our ideas and values come from. It's a radically incoherent system, and we're incredibly defensive about it. We don't want to admit, because we believe we're the pinnacle of history, we're the pinnacle of evolution, we're as good as it gets. We don't want to admit that we don't even make sense to ourselves. And if we start asking questions, it's part of why we hate philosophy. We start asking questions, it's pretty quick that we run aground and realize we don't know why we do the things we do. We can't explain why we value the things that we value. What happens normally, what would happen, Stephen, with what you just said, if there were a bunch of atheists on the call, is they'd all get defensive and try to tell you how atheism is right. And in doing that, it would sideline us from the core point. The core point being all moderns have this level of incoherence in their value systems. And that's almost by design, because modernism's proposition is we can give up on all traditions. We don't need traditions. We don't need gods. We don't need nature. We'll just today decide for ourselves what we're going to do today on no basis whatsoever, just because we feel like it. The incoherence is baked right into the core proposition of modernity. And the clarity of that, as we walk through the ancient and medieval orders, it becomes clear when we see how internally coherent the ancient worldview was and how internally coherent the medieval worldview was. Things that in the modern world we think of as a bunch of separate topics, in these other worldviews, they're all knit together into a way that makes sense. And it's only when we see how much sense they make that we can then turn to modernism and go, Jesus, none of this makes sense. Like, none of it explains the rest of it. It's all just a big toolbox full of facts that we deploy when we think it's useful. We don't actually have a coherent worldview. So thanks for bringing that up. Phil and then Sharon. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I must admit, I sort of differ slightly from your description in this sense.
Please.
It seems to me what you're describing as a pan-paganism that believes in the life cycle. Fine, I agree with that. But as contemporary science tells me, at least, that there is a greater dimension, that the universe, in a sense, ultimately, if you want to talk about it as being circular, is a struggle between what we now call, which we do not understand, by the way, dark energies forced to push the universe outwards, and gravity, whether strong enough to maintain it so it goes back to a kind of pulsating dynamic of the big boom. But the problem with that is that life is a minuscule suburb that exists in this greater dynamic. And that then I begin to wonder, if I was to equivocate between the two, then we would maybe see that this sort of pan-paganism is a very precious thing that's exceptional in the universe, and we should value that over a grander, careless universe that could care less about our existence. And that in a sense, by obeying the greater point of view, you are trivializing life and the importance of life in itself. And so to me, I'm not quite sure how to fit this sort of circular model, which I believe in and love and think is precious, with this sort of at least somewhat longer range linear, if it's circular at all, is it falls back into a different universe, or whether it just fade away, as T.S. Eliot says, in the whimper of existence. I do not know. Okay, so I actually am exactly existing in the crack.
Right.
But I think it is at least time for us to understand that there is a difference between a caring universe and an uncaring universe. And that's what we should focus on. And care, therefore, in a sense, I've always thought care was maybe not the most important virtue, but the gateway to all the other virtues. That if you do not have care, then you might as well be careless, right? Because the world, the universe, not the world, but the universe is unconcerned with us or life or anything. It in a sense, is an anomaly that happened to exist. That's why, following the water is not enough, right? Like, the balance for the chemistry that is necessary must be the proper amount of water among with the other things to create the potentiality that allows care to care. I mean,
right.
I think that in some sense, even though ecology, in a sense, is a smaller structure within a grand universe, it is a preciousness of it that we should accept and understand and try to at least protect. So that is my deep belief. That's why I believe in a kind of the divine. But but then within that is you have careless people who could care less because they're seeking power. And so that itself, I guess in some grand sense, is more obedient to the grander universe that could care less about what everything is. So I am caught in this paradox between linearity and circularity.
This is going to come up over and over in this book. This question of the sacred and its relationship to everything else. It's when we talk about the different epochs of civilization being defined by how they get meaning, how they prioritize the sources of meaning. Well, that's a roundabout way of saying how they define the sacred. What is sacred and why is it sacred? We're going to, in some sense, be talking about what you just raised every single session that we do on this book. So we'll have lots of time to dig into this. It's going to be a rich area to explore. Sharon and then James. Go ahead, Sharon.
I guess I view things very simplistically. And when I read this paragraph where he says the ancient worldview is naturalist, physiocratic, I looked it up. It's an economic theory put forward by a guy called Francois Duquesne. And he was a physician, and he extrapolated the way he thought the world functioned on the circulatory system. And that's when it says, nature is a dynamic order of existence that rules and runs on its own. And the body does run on its own.
That's right.
Right? That it carries on autonomously like our breathing or digestive processes or evaporation and condensation of water through its meteorological cycles. That's all nature. That's all the body. And he extrapolated this to wealth. He thought the circulation of wealth was vital to the economy. And this is the underpinnings of the ancients. And he thought wealth came from the land and the labor of the people. And that was it in a nutshell. And so if you could, so I'm having trouble putting it all together.
Let me help you with that. So when Kenneth Smith uses the term physiocratic, he's not referring to an economic theory.
Okay.
The guy who used the term physiocratic is not the source of what Kenneth's talking about the ancients doing. Rather, it's the other way around. The ancients are the source of the idea that this economist is trying to build his theory around. Physiocratic, the way he means the term here, the economist you're describing is trying to interpret that idea, but it didn't start with him. And the idea that the circulation of the money is essential to the economy was not what the Greeks meant by physiocratic. It's a reasonable way to take the Greek idea and apply it to the realm of an economy, but it's not what the Greeks were thinking about. They were thinking about the idea that, like Kafka said, in the contest between yourself and the world, back the world. The world is more real than we are. It lasts longer than we do. It's more authoritative than we are. And even the gods, in the ancient Greek sense, are manifestations of nature. They don't exist before it or above it, transcendental in relationship to it. That what is divine and sacred is immanent in nature, not transcendental above nature. And so this term physiocracy, that it's sort of, that's implied by his term physiocratic, we can use that as a shorthand to refer to the entire ancient worldview. And the idea of physiocracy is that it's nature that rules. And people can try to emulate nature, and the gods may help us understand parts of nature and may reflect authority within nature. But in general, it's nature that rules, right? Nature has given us the law of gravity, and we don't get to make it go away just because we don't like it. You jump off a cliff, or more typically, you're a teenager and you jump off a roof because you feel like you're immortal. Guess what? Guess who wins in that contest? Gravity's going to win, because nature wins, because we live in a physiocracy. This is derived from the Greek term for nature, physis, which means becoming or flowing. The idea that all things that are real don't so much exist so much as they become. They were something else. In the future, they'll be something else, and now they've got a foot in both worlds. They're transforming, and that's what it means to be real. That there's this flow, there's this transformation. So, the medieval worldview, we might think. Oh, yeah, I'll come back to the caveat. The medieval worldview we might think of as a theocracy. The idea was that the ancient cultures had failed in their promise to create a fair, just world centered in nature. We looked at Rome towards the end of days, and it was just deeply corrupt. And so the Christians responded by saying, you can't trust nature. You certainly can't trust people to interpret nature. So instead, we'll put God in charge, because God is infallible. We need an infallible guide to right and wrong in making decisions. God will be our guide. And the more closely we hew to God, the more correct our cultures will be, and our laws and our civilization. And so that's a theocracy. The promise of a theocracy is that God is in charge. God rules, theokrati. And of course, the problem with that is it turned out God didn't rule. What ruled were people who claimed that they speak for God. And those people were just as corruptible as the ancient Romans were. And by the end of the medieval epoch, all of the institutions that were most devoted to telling us what God thought were instead telling us what people in charge of those institutions thought would make them rich and powerful. And that's why there had to be a revolution against the medieval worldview. So in some sense, we might say that the medieval worldview can be summed up as a theocracy, as long as we add more caveats to it. The modern worldview can be summed up as a democracy, not in the modern sense of the word, but in the literal sense. The people rule. People, demos kratein, right? Now, maybe the people are organized in a very egalitarian way where lots of people get a say. Maybe they're organized, in a tyrannical way where an individual or a small committee gets a say, but it's still people, right? Those people are no longer pretending that nature gives them the right. Their superior nature gives them the right to rule. They're no longer pretending that God gave them the divine right to rule. They're saying, I'm ruling because I'm ruling. I'm ruling because I'm in charge. I'm a person and I'm in charge, and I'm the source of authority. And it's the same if it's a democratic in the modern sense. Even if everybody's having a say and all our voices are combined and we're governing that way, it's still not guided by nature or by God. It's guided by whatever people happen to think they should do, whether en masse or in small numbers. So you could sum up the modern worldview as a democracy if it's understood in that general term. So what he's going to do here is spell out what these things mean. And as we'll see, as we get to a deeper understanding of physiocracy, it will both help you to understand the ancient worldview, but it will also help you to understand those economic theories, because you'll be able to see what he was trying to model. And what he's trying to model is that thing that Heraclitus pointed out, that nature has this way of harnessing its powers against each other so that they work in tandem. In opposition, they pull you back towards the healthy zone to make things happen. And flow, physis, is core to that. So you could see why he chose the name he did, this modern economist. Does that make sense, Sharon? Okay, we'll come back to it. James and then Marianne. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, I like this idea of, the eminence of the divine in nature. And this isn't that what Spinoza, try to bring back, right? The idea that that nature, that God or its substance, the divine is in nature. And but then Hegel disagreed with that, and he wanted to, build his system on Christianity, right? And also giving the humans the rationality, the special rationality to impose itself, on nature.
Yes.
And so, but Nietzsche, of course, responded by giving it back to nature, this kind of will to power. The will to power is not just in the human being, but it's in nature itself, right?
Right.
And so he's kind of like, elevating nature again, like you're saying that the ancients did.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, so I guess it comes down, we don't know which is right or who's wrong, but it comes down to which way is the best way to live ethically and meaningfully for our lives, right? And I think that you can't just think that you can decide to disrespect, nature and impose yourself on nature and disregard and not care about nature, because this kind of idea of care about nature is really caring about yourself too. So if you don't care about nature, you're not caring about yourself, right? And I think that Heidegger, definitely pointed that out, that the care is important in our lives, because it's a kind of taking care of not just yourself, but what you really are and where you came from. So yeah.
Yeah, it's you bring up an interesting point about Hegel. One of the fascinating things, if you study the history of axiology, which is often summed up as the virtues, studying the history of people trying to work out what are the qualities that we need to be cultivating in ourselves to be good people. One of the interesting things is that in the ancient world, it was often driven by people like Aristotle looking around them in society and trying to evaluate what was good and what was not good and trying to figure out why. But by the time you shift to the medieval epoch, the approach to the virtues is radically different. The approach to the virtues is you start with the conclusion, and the conclusion is Aristotle and Cicero are right, and the Bible is right. And then they work backwards to try to create justifications that prove that the ancients were right and the Bible was right. And so you get this 1,000-year period where the study of the virtues, they are not allowing themselves to change the list of virtues in any substantial way. And all of their reasoning is oriented around trying to reach the foreordained conclusion that's blessed in advance by the church. And this is one of the problems with not a theocracy as they meant to give us, but a theocracy as it's actually possible to give in the world in which people are speaking for God, is that it leads to dogma. And in dogma, some answers are right, some answers are wrong, and if you give the wrong answer, you're going to die at the stake. So you better give the right answer, which means all of your reasoning is bent towards arriving at the foreordained conclusion. And you see that in Hegel as well. Hegel's carrying over medievalism into his naturalism. His approach to the dialectic with the bud, blossom, and the fruit is very physiocratic. It's very focused on nature as the authority. But the problem is he wants it both ways. He wants the ancient worldview and he wants the medieval worldview. He's not recognizing the way in which they're radically incompatible with each other, even though according to his own theories, if you look at the core, the essence of his theories, they have to be radically incompatible, but he doesn't want them to be because he's not willing to challenge that part of his beliefs. And so he's trying to organize it in such a way that the conclusion comes out, like you said, James, the way that he needs it to come out in the medievalist way that he's thinking about that. And it creates this very interesting dissonance in when you're reading Hegel. Okay, he's caught in a tug of war between these two incompatible philosophical drives. And which one rules at which point in his writing is a very interesting phenomenon to see. But part of the reason to do this examination of these epochs and these worldviews is not just so that we know how we ought to live, because we're never going to resolve that fully. It's always going to be a struggle. As finite mortal people, we're never going to fully figure this out. But to get further down the path of figuring it out, we need to learn to recognize where the different shards in our reasoning are coming from. And so we're studying physiocracy and theocracy and democracy, so that when we think our way through them in our brain, we notice when we transition from one to the other and go, oh, wait a minute. I thought I was having a simple linear flow of thought, but I actually just hopped from one worldview to an incompatible worldview without admitting to myself what I just did. And if I can admit to myself that's what I did, I can create some freedom of choice for what I ought to do in the future. I won't just be a symptom of this Frankensteinian construct in my head. I can start to be a person and shape myself. That's one of the main reasons to do this, is to get some, to get that Archimedean perspective on yourself, so that you can get some leverage, to have some ability to shape yourself, to become a mature person. Marianne and then Phil. Go ahead, Marianne.
So what I'm grateful to Kenneth Smith is when he said all things deserve to perish, that is natural justice. I'm grateful because it takes it out of the context of this and that. And it releases me into the sense that not only do I know how to live better, but I also know how to die. And one of the things that I like about the pandemic is that it gives me the sense that the aggrandizing of funerals and everything like that is really such a construct of overconsumption on some level. And I have a green burial now, so just put me in the earth. And I am grateful to Kenneth to actually say it out loud, because at first I was like, whoa, and now I'm like, thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. Yeah, that's among the things that physiocracy, theocracy, and democracy see completely differently. I mean, I can say until the cows come home that every important term is defined differently in these worldviews, but it's not until we actually start to work through them and see, my God, even time is different, even meaning is different, even life is different, and as you say, even death is different. So is death justice? Or is death a heinous crime that has to be overcome? Or is death pointless and meaningless? These are the three answers that we get from physiocracy, theocracy, and democracy. In the physiocratic world order, nature has evolved into its current form because this is functional. And some parts of nature may be arbitrary and could be changed, but other parts of nature are essential and are part of what makes nature work at all. And if we mess with those parts of nature, we break things at a deep fundamental level. And so we shouldn't. Distinguishing which parts are which are the parts of nature that nature doesn't really care about, it's just a coincidence that it came out that way, and which parts of nature are there by design, by convergence, because this makes everything else possible. That's important to making freedom meaningful. Because if we think freedom means the freedom to do anything we want, which modernism promises, then it means that it includes the freedom to do things that would destroy the universe, that the universe can't exist without, but we change it anyway because we're free, infinitely free, right? So a physiocratic perspective on freedom says that we're trying to learn to distinguish what's essential and lawful in nature from what's just a coincidence. And that we want to exercise our freedom in ways that align with natural law and that we focus our changes only on things that don't break natural law, on the places where things are coincidences, where we have choice. And if we do that, we're going to be more successful in life. We're going to be well, I can't overstate the number of reasons why one would do this under the physiocratic worldview. And so that applies to death as well. It can be, for both moderns and medievals, shocking to hear the idea that death is justice, that there's a reason why death exists in the world. Nature made death for a reason. There are species that live an inordinate amount of time. Most of them are single-celled. By the time you get up to true multicellularism, death is just built right into the package. And we may not like that. We may not want that to be true, but nature did it that way. And what we're going to find is that it's not a coincidence. And so there were some of the Greeks who said that when you find something in nature that is the working out of the essential laws of nature, that's an example of something that's not a coincidence. And that the working out of those laws is justice itself. And so by that argument, death is justice. We may not know why death is justice. We may not like it to be justice. But if we, yes, I think Sharon would say, you know, if you spend enough time working in the realms between life and death, you will learn gradually why nature has built this in and why it's important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a component of the life cycle.
Exactly.
Well, could you imagine if you didn't have death? I mean, there would be trillions and trillions and trillions of people on the planet, for example.
There's
not to mention other species, just humans alone.
That's right. There's a Greek myth of Tithonus and Selene. People used to say that, people these days often say that Artemis is the goddess of the moon, but that's not quite right. She's the goddess of wild things. She's been conflated with a Titan, a Greek Titan called Selene, and Selene was the Titan of the moon. The Greeks have a myth in which Selene had a mortal lover, and they had a great time together, but she grew sad thinking that he was going to grow old and die because he's mortal. And so she made a wish that Tithonus, her lover, would never die. And it was so, but it didn't stop him from growing old. And he got older and older and weaker and more withered. And his eternity was a misery. But, you know, she was a goddess. She had set it in motion. It was not going to stop now. And that for all the rest of time, Tithonus was just shriveling up and shrinking until his voice was like a cricket. And that Selene, going about, you know, in the sky as the moon soars through the sky, she's carrying with her this little chirping cricket, which was her mortal lover that she mistakenly got in the way of death and said, I will make there not be death for a mortal, and lo, there wasn't, and nobody was happy about it.
The converse of that is, excuse me, Rick, is you have kids who are born with this genetic disorder called progeria.
Yes.
And where they age, by the time you're 10 years old, you're 100.
Yes.
And it without the mindset and experience and exposure that comes from living.
It's terrible.
And by the time you're 6 or 7, you're getting the broken hips and all the diseases that old people get. And this is a genetic malformation. And it's always interesting to see, because one of the things I did was pediatric anesthesia, to see this whole body with a child's mind.
That's right.
So that as you talked about the Greek story, I was reminded of that.
Yeah, and that's one that's missing, right? I mean, if the Greeks ever had a story that explained progeria, I've never heard it. I think they missed out on it, and it really is part of what needs to be part of the mythos to understand the ways that death can go wrong. You know, one of the ways to understand that death is justice is when we think about tyrants. One of the best things about tyrants is that just like everybody else, they die. No matter how powerful they are, their tyranny at least ends with them. And of course, that's the reason why one of the things tyrants want more than anything is medical advances that will allow them to live forever. Because they dream of a tyranny that they impose that nobody can ever stop. And death is really a great safeguard for us in this regard. It's like, yeah, I might die, but so will Stalin, right? I might die, but so will Hitler. There's all kinds of people whose death is a great blessing, and I don't need to bring it about. It will happen on its own. Anyway, it's a complicated subject, but...
Do you think we would invent death if it didn't exist, in the sense that just like we invented heaven? Like, I mean, you'll die someday. Like, and we're just keep on living as if, well, I'm going to get there.
Imagining an end to everything, wishing that it would happen. There's a Star Trek episode like that, right? There's a Star Trek episode about overpopulation, in which they cherish life so much that all they do is keep adding people and nobody ever dies, and they're desperate for a plague to come along and bring them into balance. These are dark, difficult subjects, but generally speaking, this whole area, death itself is of a fundamentally different nature in meaning to us under a physiocracy, in which, as part of nature, it must be there for a reason, than it is under a theocracy, in which death is an evil to be defeated so that we can live for all eternity, whether being rewarded for all eternity or being tortured for all eternity, depending on which side of the great sort you end up on. Or in the modern world, where death means nothing at all, because life means nothing at all, because nothing means anything at all. It's just, what can you get before you die? The reinterpretations of these fundamental questions is complete between these worldviews. Even though in any point in history, the transitions from one to another are gradual, the alienness of them to each other is unmistakable once you see them in their own terms. Phil and then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, it seems like this meeting has cast Hegel as kind of a conservative villain, and I need to defend that.
He's not
because he exists
villain.
in a transitional world.
Yes,
I think what he was trying to do was indebted to Kant, but he was trying to correct Kant by putting in a kind of dynamic system, right?
Yes.
Now, his mistake might be that he posited too much of the promise in culture itself, right? That it will do so. I was particularly impressed. I must say I'm not a Hegel scholar, so I'll admit that right from the beginning. But I was impressed by a meeting I went to that talked about the psychology of Hegel. And I don't know whether he invented, but he certainly advocated for a double analytical system, or what I would call double mirroring, that it begins with the experience, the empirical experience itself, and that experience is experienced subjectively, and subjectively mind, of course, mind is an important part of understanding, and that's come from, I guess, Kant all the way back to Plato. And that in a sense, mind was trying to resolve and objectify the subjective experience. And the double mirroring involved the fact that once mind understands this, and although nature contains a kind of, how should I say, a subliminal, unconscious understanding of mind, then mind projects that objectivity onto nature and then reabsorb it into a system that's now subjective, that is owned by mind, but is also objectified. And I thought that double mirroring is kind of interesting. I compare with when you see a mirror, it's in reverse. But when you see a double mirror, it turns back into the way things are. So that's kind of interesting. And I thought okay, but what is the difference except now that he have objectified and owned this subjective experience as an objective thing that now you can deal with in terms of a productive construct, right, of mind. And so that part perhaps is traditionalist, but there is an excess in Hegel that because it's put in a dynamic system, the excess exists in its incompleteness in evolution. And that excess caused, therefore, mind, I guess, in culture, to, in a sense, explore the excess that exists that could become the actuality. And so I think that's a progressive part. So he exists in that transitional state between the static and the dynamic.
Yeah.
And the
that's right.
dynamic is where the excess of potentiality comes from,
Right.
because you're not stuck in this objectification. The objectification itself is transformed by additional subjective experiences that experience it another way, in a sense. So that, in a sense, accounts for also, in a way, at least understanding. I don't know if nature changed, but understanding, in a sense, continue to posit a different objectivity onto nature, even though it is subjective and it should remain maybe in the experience itself. If there's a mistake, is that maybe it should remain subjective, and like I said, in the realm of Artemis. But I think so often we think of him, he is conservative in the sense that he is trying to preserve this part of mind as an important construct that's necessary, but he also allows it to be subjective and dynamic and rolling forward, which is completely changes Kant. And I think that, so therefore, in a sense, it was a calling for people like Marx, right? I mean, like who applied it mistakenly, but nonetheless, it was a calling for action or praxis to be engaged in the world, not just mere reflective contemplation that's double mirror, right? So that, I mean, so you can't put him in one camp or another without thinking that it is he's actually in both camps.
That's right. Yeah, and it's interesting because, when we look at this existentialist tradition and how much Hegelianism is in it, how much the dialectic is in it, it would become very easy to hero worship Hegel, or at least to oversimplify him into a cartoon of himself. But like any other person, he exists at a point in history. He's in transition from one schema to another, and he's not going to be any pure, perfect summation of a philosophy. He's always going to be, like anybody else, about, what do I want to say? I want to say Nietzsche wears on his sleeve his struggles. Nietzsche's transformation in his ideas from the old ideas to the new ideas are all over Nietzsche's writing. You can't read Nietzsche and not be slapped in the face with how clearly he's changing from one set of ideas to another. But with more organized philosophers like Hegel, it's easy to read them and misunderstand that's also applying to them. It's easy to read them and think that they represent some static set of ideas. But with Hegel, especially, the more we understand these different lens systems, the more we can look at Hegel and see the ways in which he does have a foot in both worlds. He is struggling, he's at a point in the transformation. And if he hadn't written when he did, the way that he did, other people like Nietzsche couldn't have come along later and pointed out Hegel's own, inconsistencies. It's like each person becomes an example for the others, not only to learn from, but to also to rebel against and to try to overcome. So, it's very useful to us that Hegel writes in the ways that he does at the point in history that he's writing, where he brings some things into focus, not just through what he meant to do, but what he didn't mean to do, but did anyway. It's both useful. Stephen, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I'm just sort of struck. Hegel's views seem to be macrocosmic or big picture sort of theory. If you look at the sort of thought that was more common prior to Hegel, it was the image, God's made this big world for us. Mm-hmm. I evolve as an individual. I'm going to go through my life, create my successes, achieve my goals, and die and go to heaven, whatever. But this is something that fractures with the time of Hegel. Hegel's talking about the entire cultures evolving. That doesn't seem to have been a predominant thought before him, but it does come from Lessing. Lessing's tractate, Education of the Human Race, is where it'd be interesting to just see how much of Hegel was influenced by this. But this idea that the mass evolution this ends up crushing the individual. This is what the existentialists tended to notice when they fought back for the individual.
Right, right. The tension between the part and the whole, between the individual and the culture, is one that it's too easy to oversimplify and come down on one side or the other. And we could look at any number of political movements that followed that sought to oversimplify it and make it be, it's either all the individual or it's not the individual at all. You know what I mean? We can almost sort something like 2/3 to 3/4 of all political movements since Hegel into falling squarely into one side or the other. The people who are willing to embrace the more complicated truth, which is that there couldn't be wholes without parts and there couldn't be parts without wholes, that part of what makes nature what it is that parts and wholes exist at the same time, and that they're acting at the same time at their respective different levels of organization, and that if they didn't do that, the whole thing would collapse. You know, it's like, it's not true that the cells in your body don't matter because you wouldn't live without them, but it's not true that the whole body doesn't exist and only the cells matter, because most of the things that we think of as the things we value in the human experience are only possible because of the things we do beyond a single cell at a time. You know, the whole masses of systems working together to help each other. And so it puts us in this uncomfortable position, in the same way that Heraclitus made a whole bunch of people uncomfortable by saying it's not fair to say that we are, it's only fair to say that we become, that the nature of our existence is a nature of transformation. In the same way, the discovery of the microscopic world, and that we're made up of all these cells, and that all the cells are alive. They have their own separate life from us. It's like it's in us, but it lives separate from us at the same time. This was massively disturbing. One of the, I wish there would be more books written about that period in scientific discovery, the enormous popular reaction to the discovery of the microscopic world. It was really disturbed people in ways that we've now forgotten about. In some ways, every bit as much as the theory of evolution terrified people, the discovery that we are made of cells and that they're alive too really, really disturbed people. And I don't think...
What about the theory, Rick? What about the theory, Rick, that we are also made up of bacteria, and it's bacteria that's controlling the way we think?
I love this.
Think about that. Oh my God.
I love this idea that, the people who had managed to make their peace with the idea that we're made up of cells, the way that they made their peace is saying, well, at least all the cells have the same DNA and they're all derived from the same egg. And then the discovery that actually that's a minority of the cells in your body. The majority of the cells in your body are in your digestive tract, and you'd be dead without them. But they're all alien and hostile and other. They're, not only are they not related, they're as far away as you can get in the chain of living things. They're in completely separate domains of life. But we'd be dead without them. It's like,
but I was just going to add, right? That Hegel gave us his children, the fascists and the Marxists, who both dreamed of their huge grand vision for humanity. Unfortunately, there'll be a few graves along the way, but and how many other movements has Hegel spawned with their grand vision, in which everybody else becomes fuel to be consumed by it?
That's right.
Well, I think it's important to point out that Hegel did not like the term synthesis.
Right.
That he thought this subjective, objective, quote, synthesis was actually a unity. It wasn't a blending of them together into a mixture of indifferentiation.
Right.
But it was a layering that retained at least some of the otherness that's within the layering without the blending process.
Right.
I think that it was too difficult to understand the layering, retaining the complexity and difference within the layer that Cézanne tried to do,
right.
That Picasso didn't. That actually is an important distinction, but it's too difficult to understand that layering rather than a blending into the oneness of the blending rather than the oneness of the layering of difference.
That's right. And that the nature of the layers isn't just that we build big important things on top of small unimportant things. That's like a modernist interpretation, but rather the Heraclitean dynamic phusis, that the forces of individual cellular life create one set of directions in us. The forces of harmonious multicellular life create another set of directions in us, and neither one gets to win. They're not put in a blender. You don't get a gray average out of them. You don't get a compromise between them. They aren't glued together into a static shape, but they're kept always in dynamic tension so that the needs of the cells and the needs of the whole are always tugging on each other, pulling back and forth in this kind of dynamic shifting harmony, which is the core nature of the physiocratic dialectic that Heraclitus and Hegel are talking about. This is really hard for us as moderns to be comfortable with. And it certainly had no comfortable place to exist in the medieval worldview either. It's about as alien as you can get. And it's why one of the main places you see this kind of acceptance of this dynamic, tension that makes life possible is only in places like medicine, where they have no choice. They have to deal with the dynamic tensions of the body's systems that push and pull on each other to keep you alive. And they're forced to learn it by the subject matter that they work on. But the farther away you get from that, the more people can go back to comforting illusions and thinking that the body is just flesh and that we just exist and we aren't in tension and we aren't flowing, and all these less challenging ideas we slip into.
So when in history did people realize there is such a thing as virus and bacteria? Do you know about? Not during medieval period. Did they know what that bacteria and virus were during medieval period?
People hypothesized for millennia, but nobody really knew until the microscope. The microscope was just a world changer for us.
But was that what microscope was invented when then?
It was like 1800s, von Leeuwenhoek and Robert Hooke. And others were among the ones to first do it. And some of these scientists, I can't remember if it was Hooke that I'm thinking of, when they first discovered it, they wouldn't tell anybody about it for decades. They just kept notebooks because they spent the whole time shaking their head going, I can barely accept this and I'm looking right at it. If I tell other people, they're not going to accept it. They're going to blame me for this idea. I think I just better just take notes for a while, not tell anybody and not talk about it because it's too horrible. In some ways, the theory of evolution was a much softer change because people have been imagining evolution for millennia. We just didn't quite have the mechanisms worked out before Darwin. But with the microscopic world, it was a huge shock. It was
under your nose.
Right. It really created this
more freaky than that.
Yeah, it was freaky, right? It created this feeling of contamination and impurity. It was just ew. All of our anti-cultural training went off and go, I'm in hell. Sharon, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Well, I think us human beings coexist with bacteria from our mouth to our anus. And if you look around at nature, you go outside and you look at some of the plants, particularly if you get in some of these forests, you could see plants coexisting with each other, different types of plants. So I think, again, we are just a replication of nature.
Yeah, that's right. It's a physiocratic perspective that you just shared with us, right? Nature rules. We may have nice, clean, tidy ideas about what it should mean to be human, but when we actually look in nature, what we see is this synthesis of alien things to create a new whole that cooperates.
Correct. And it's a reflection of ourselves, actually.
Yeah. And, the more we study fungi and discover their amazing capacity to pull individual elements out of the environment. They can pull heavy metals out of the environment. They can collect gold. They can collect anything you name it. their hyphae are so tiny and have such tiny pores that they can pull in things at a microscopic level and concentrate them. And that's a power that really no other main area of life has, except, well, bacteria and archaea, right? The other tiny things. So if we didn't have them, you know, we might think they're gross and they're icky and we wish that we could exterminate them, right? Because moderns are germaphobes. We're terrified of contamination. But if we could, you know, the modernists dreamed that with enough antibiotic soap, we could make ourselves clean. If we ever succeeded in eliminating all the germs, of course we die, right? Because we need the germs. We need the fungi. We need the archaea. It's the messiness that we don't like that makes life itself possible. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, but the funny thing is that the instrument of the microscope could create its own actual misunderstanding or
Sure.
abuse as well.
Sure.
Because there was early on a guy, this was before photography was acute enough to actually take a picture of it. He would draw the sperm. Inside the sperm was a little man, which continued the myth that the male provided the seed.
Yes.
And the female was merely the soil and the garden that nurtured the seed.
That's
so
right.
I mean, like that is a continuation of the oppression of women, because they didn't actually contribute anything. They were just merely the garden.
Just soil.
And that's why men have to tend to the garden.
That's right.
By planting their
right.
seed.
Which is, God help us.
I mean, that was actually a use of another sign.
Who was that guy, Phil? Who was that guy? Because he was.
I don't know specifically, but it was interesting. Of course, that myth was dispelled soon after they had actually better pictures.
Yes.
Of what the thing was.
Yes. Yeah, you know, it's like for anything that's true in nature, there is some ridiculous caricature of it that people believe first, because they didn't want to deal with the full complexity of the way the world really works. So yeah, it's not that the DNA combined to create a new novel human being who's never existed before, who unfolds from a single cell. Now that sounds complicated. There's just a teeny tiny little person in there and he just gets bigger and bigger and that becomes a baby, right? I mean, you can see why this appealed as a cartoonish, you know, version of nature, but of course nothing is ever as clean and simple as we want it to be. Go ahead,
Thank
Sharon.
God for humor. Thank God for humor.
I have one final thought.
Please.
As we talk about moderns, and this is the philosophy by which I live. Always be curious before you're judgmental.
Yeah.
So you always ask questions. And if I meet somebody from Japan, because they're from Japan, I don't automatically assume that they will have characteristics. You communicate and you find out what that spirit, the evolution of that spirit, and if you can relate to each other.
That's right.
But to be judgmental about an entity that's unfamiliar to you really speaks very little about your spiritual evolution.
That's right. Yeah, because people's relationship to their culture isn't as straightforward as being stamped out like little Xerox, you know, copies. We struggle with our cultures. Our cultures don't just define us by making us follow them. They also define us by spurring us to rebel against the parts of the culture we don't like. And any given culture is less describable as a set state of affairs and more describable as a number of dynamic tensions that are going on within the culture in trying to figure out who it wants to be and how people will individuate within that context.
And it's constantly
happening. Right. And that there is an amazing diversity of solutions to the problems that a culture presents to people. And so you don't know until you meet somebody. Even if you had the world's most accurate depiction of a culture, that still doesn't tell you how any given individual is going to respond to growing up in that culture. They could come out wildly different because of the nature of the culture and because of the character they were born with and the way that it sets them to agree with certain things and disagree with other things. There's just no knowing in advance. All forms of bigotry and discrimination, it's part of why they're big mistakes. These kinds of stereotyping. because the human organism, human character is so complex. You're really better off immersing yourself in the experience of a person to find out who they are than trying to reason about them a priori without having met them.
So Kenneth Smith's essays, even though he has classified the times into ancient and medieval and moderns, I prefer that it's all along a continuum, right? And for us to assess it, I think at least I look at it like that. This was the predominant action, not the only action at that period in time.
Right. It was the core set of ideas that the culture was aligning itself with / rebelling against / well, like in the modern world, you can't live a life in which you haven't thought about money and what it means to you. You can't, because money is so central that whether you like money or don't like money, you're going to know what money is, and you're going to have a lot of opinions about it. And in the same way, in different epochs, there would be other core ideas that everybody in that period of history had an opinion on, and it wouldn't all be the same opinion, and they'd all reflect it differently, but that's among the things that they're going to be wrestling with. So yeah, I'm with you. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that, well, it's all very good, but what do you do when you discover how alien things can be that are different from you? We put on rosy-coloured glasses. Even in science fiction, the aliens come down and they're like Jesus, literally like Jesus. Oh, yeah, that's just a rose-coloured glasses. But what if we find out the aliens really are completely alien to anything we can understand? Would we be so favourably disposed towards them then? And would they be favourably disposed towards us?
There's a lot of interesting science fiction stories that explore that from different angles. There are. It's a favorite subject.
But in a general concept, excuse me, Rick, when you see something that's completely alien to you, that's a point of growth in your character. Providing they're not going to physically hurt you, it's a point of growth in your character. Though there is no need to fear. And that's my philosophy, and it's very different. This is what keeps me content. I fear nothing. Because I know, because I know who I am, and at 69 years old, life is pretty good. So if it's alien, it's another point of growth.
We can sit down and sympathise with Norman Bates then. That's cool. And I'll have a shower when he's there.
Well, I think more what she's saying is that the response to Norman Bates doesn't have to be fear or love. It can be, you'd like to figure out what makes him tick.
That's right.
Why is he the way he is? And what we discover is, if we learn why he is the way he is, we discover some uncomfortable things about ourselves as moderns, about why we are the way we are, things that we didn't think about because they're clearer in Norman Bates than they are in us.
Well, Duchovny and Brad Pitt in California.
Say that again?
Duchovny and Brad Pitt in the movie California.
I haven't seen it yet.
Brad Pitt's a psycho and Duchovny's the intellectual who's trying to work him out.
Okay, now I want to see that.
When did it come out, Stephen?
Probably late 90s, something like that. California, X-Files man and
I don't know
Brad
it.
Pitt. You can't miss
I'll go
it.
look for it. Thank you, Stephen. I'll go check it out. Phil, it's yours, and then we're going to wrap up.
Well, in a sense, what Sharon's saying, and I kind of agree with that, the transitional period might be actually more interesting than the paradigmatic period, because that's when you are demanding to equivocate between two possibilities, right? And I think that, but there is something in the structure of a mind that is more difficult to see the transition between, let's say, two colors, than say, oh, that's red, that's orange, that's green, right?
Right,
So
right.
in some sense, I think the structure of mind has advantage one over the other, but the transition is actually where it's at in a way, right? And I think that may be the natural relationship of our sensing mechanism that it's difficult for us to categorize the transition. But because that's also in our experience as well, and that might actually be a fundamental problem with the structure of our mind, in a sense.
No.
So I kind of think that maybe that might be something that is actually part of our handicap, because we can't see clearly what the transition is, because we can't actually decide, is that red or is that orange? You know, then we at best hyphenate it as red orange, and we want to final grade then as red orange orange, because we don't have the language to categorize it. So yeah. I think that it is actually where it's happening, that we are moving into another era, but we haven't arrived yet. And sometimes when you manufacture a language that says that gradation specifically, then people won't even understand it. What the hell are you talking about? I mean, red, orange, orange, orange. I mean, like, just make it simple. You know, I think that is a limitation of our mind. So I appreciate what Sharon said, and I try to live in that space, but we'll always kind of in a way pull back to our categories.
Well, we'll have a lot of time to talk.
Okay. Well, I have to bring it up next time. There was something that you said earlier that I wanted to.
Yeah. Are we still doing this next time?
Yes.
All right.
And for the moment, I'm going to leave us with Kierkegaard, right? Which is life has to be lived forward, but it can only be understood backward.
Absolutely.
That's a transition.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, because that's the way it is. That's why you always engage with everything that you have. Because at the point of the experience, that's maximum learning and then reflection.
Yeah.
Well, when I started teaching color, there was a couple that was there, and this man just couldn't understand what I was talking
about. Save that thought.
He kept
Save that thought for next week.
Okay.
I got to wrap up.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye,
Rick.
Everyone. Bye, Dave. Bye, Joseph.
Thanks a lot.
Had a great time.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, Joseph. See you next time, Joe.
I'll see you next week.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I'll read the right. Poor Phil's gone, so I think it would have made him feel better.
Rick, I definitely want to talk about Aristophanes' clouds next week. Okay. All right.
Okay, bye. Bring it.
Bye.
Okay, bye.